Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my dreams lay shattered, splintered, fractured around me, scattered precariously like the glass fragments from a broken mirror into hundreds of tiny smithereens. I knew that I would never be the same ever again, as my devastating skiing accident had caused me to go flying into a tree at a grueling, harrowing high impact that would almost certainly cause catastrophic damage to my right leg that could never be corrected or righted again. I would perpetually have to live with this unfortunate encumbrance all of my life, walking around with a limp, being subjected to bouts of unreasonable shooting pain that would make me invariably grit my teeth from the agony. In truth, it was a complete miracle I was actually alive. I had hit the tree with such a powerful brute force. I had to be grateful for small mercies, however obscure or faint they actually may be. I can remember drifting in and out of consciousness after the horrifying ordeal. I also recall feeling a strange kind of suction, followed by a popping, rather like a cork being pulled out of a bottle of champagne, after which I found myself hovering above my body, looking down at a crumbled, distorted form that lay underneath the tree. I discovered to my immense surprise that this bedraggled, crumpled bundle was actually me. I felt strangely disconnected, indifferent, and rather detached from my own physical body. I could hear the frenzied, terrified cries of people shouting, "Oh my God! We're losing him! Do something! We're losing him!" I do not remember anything else after that, until one day I woke up in my hospital bed, connected to all kinds of tubes. I was informed that my now withered leg was a physical disability or impediment in my life that would require a significant amount of pain management. Indeed, amputation had been on the cards, a viable option that had been seriously contemplated. Ostensibly, my surgeon had decided against it, and that my leg should be spared. It was well worth saving, he thought. On occasion I would regret that decision, as the pain that I was to experience in the years that followed was sometimes quite unbearable, unrelenting, and vicious. But I had learnt to live with it, rather like a surfer moving with the waves on his surfboard, going with the flow of the ocean. I was to wake up in a hospital bed, heavily bandaged, with plasters on every available appendage, from the plethora of brutal breaks I'd sustained. I felt so disorientated and confused at first, I didn't actually know where I was, as solicitous nurses and doctors hovered around me like buzzing bees over a hive. "How are we today, Griffin? It's Griffin Holmes, am I right?" came a deep, gravelly voice. "I'm Dr. Wallace Fortescue." "I'm Griffin Holmes, that's right, Doctor. I suppose I'm doing all right, but I am experiencing a lot of shooting pain, uncomfortable spasms, especially in my right leg here." "Well, that is to be expected, Mr. Holmes, but we manage it with pain medications for you, and anti-inflammatories. You're a very lucky man indeed to be alive. For a moment it was touch and go there. We almost lost you a handful of times, I regret to say. In truth, we didn't think you would make it, but it seems you're a fighting man in more ways than one. The rare kind that always gives us hope here at the hospital." By all accounts, I'm very glad to say that you didn't sever your spine. Things could have panned out a lot worse for you. A whole lot worse. But I am going to make a full recovery, am I not, Doc? I'm going to be able to continue my job as a firefighter, am I not? Not in a physical capacity, no. I'm afraid not, Mr. Holmes. Please call me Griffin, Doctor. Griffin, said the doctor, clearing his throat awkwardly. As I was saying, your right leg is seriously impaired. I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings, but I need to be perfectly straight with you. That is the way I always am with my patients. The long-term prognosis for you is very bleak in regards to your leg. Your leg was badly shattered. Never seen anything like it in my life. It was almost unsalvageable. It certainly will disqualify you from active duty in the fire brigade. At this horrifying revelation, my heart sank like a heavy stone, sinking, plummeting, diving to the bottom of a lake, along with all my hopes and dreams. But, Doc, you don't understand. Firefighting is my life. It's all I've ever wanted to do since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. I'm an active man, always loved sports, outdoor adventures. Are you saying it's all over for me, Doc? Because if you are, you might as well be signing my death certificate right now. I know it sounds grim, Griffin. I admit that some of your outdoor activities you once pursued, like skiing, are things of the past. But that does not mean you cannot go out into nature, enjoy the natural world. But there are some things you're not going to be able to do anymore, with the ardent passion you previously pursued them, like skiing, running, long-distance hiking, cycling, and stuff like that. But there's no reason why you can't go hunting. I'm afraid, Doctor, you're listing all the things I love best in the world. In other words, you're telling me that my life has to become much more sedentary from now on. In a manner of speaking, yes, but your life is most certainly not over. There's so much to live for. You can pursue other interests. I've had patients wearing your shoes going on to achieve great things in their life. One man has become a fine potter. His work sells for considerable sums of money all over North America. Another has become a very successful aspiring chef. Perhaps life is drawing you down a different path. It's my belief, Griffin, from working with so many patients over the years, that nothing is ever random. Well, not as random as we may think. You may be surprised to learn that good can come out of bad, like the green grass shooting through the burnt carnage of a wildfire. If you think that's going to cheer me up, Doctor, forget it. The last thing I can envisage for my life is becoming a potter, or a cook for that matter. I've never been good with my hands. Good grief, I couldn't think of anything I would despise more. As for my cooking skills, I've been told that my eggs taste just like bullets. The doctor chuckled. Well, the good news there is, Griffin, if your eggs are like bullets, there's room for improvement. If the doctor's startling revelations were not a big enough blow for me, that day was to get progressively worse, a whole lot worse if that was at all possible. When my fiancé, Anwar Montanaro, came to visit me in hospital later on in the day, she too delivered me a great big punch in the guts. Talk about kicking a man when he's down. Was I not hurting enough in every part of my body? I knew something was up the moment Anwar entered my ward. Even the way she moved was stiff. Worse still, she was refusing to make any eye contact with me, avoiding my gaze very deliberately, like someone carrying the weight of a very guilty conscience on their shoulders, who would rather be anywhere else in the world than in the hospital ward with me. That was very clear to me. I knew she was going to unleash a bombshell that would potentially explode in my face like a landmine. I just knew it. I could feel it. The atmosphere in my hospital ward had become cold, unfriendly, clinical even. I waited with bated breath to hear what she was going to say, as if waiting for that nasty strike from a king cobra. Anwar twiddled her fingers awkwardly, playing with her long, perfectly manicured bright pink nails that were covered with a plethora of glittery designs. She studied them as though they were a great source of fascination for her, A premeditated excuse not to have to face me head on. I watched her as she dragged her chair across the floor towards my bed, never once looking at me. But when I reached out to hold her hand in mine, she pushed it away. "Griffin, we need to talk. Now, you know I'd never wish what happened to you on anyone. I really, really wouldn't. But we've got to get real here. I mean, your accident on the ski slopes, it's changed everything for us. I don't know how to say this to you, but I just don't think we should get married anymore. It wouldn't work out in the circumstances," she said, pulling off her engagement ring, placing it on my bedside table. This revelation hit me like a sledgehammer. "I see," I said, my voice growing hoarse, my whole body now weighted down by a huge heaviness. "Why not?" "Well, it's not practical, is it? Let's face it. Not any more. I mean, not with that gammy leg of yours. I'm an active person. Your condition would be a hindrance to our relationship. We couldn't do those outdoor activities together that we were planning to do. We can't climb mountains together. Stuff like that. It's a real bummer, I know, for you, but it's equally so for me. If not more so in the circumstances." "I see. So my crippled leg is a very big obstacle to our relationship," I said sarcastically, digging the knife in as hard as I possibly could. "After all, you couldn't be seen marrying a cripple." "Now, don't be so reactive, Griffin. I'm saying it as it is. I'd only start to resent you if we couldn't do the things together we used to do. And you know I would. I wouldn't want that to happen. You need a woman who can take care of you in your present condition. A woman who's sedentary, willing to look after you." "Oh, I see. So I need a nurse, do I?" "That's not what I'm saying." "Get out," I shouted. "Get out. I don't need to hear any of this. You make me sick to the stomach. Get out." "Now, there's no need to be like that, Griffin. You're being exceedingly unreasonable." "I said, get out. Did you hear me? Get out." The nurse, who'd been in the ward, taking down some brief notes, heard our conversation. She immediately flew to my defence, like a buzzard guarding a carcass from other predators. She pounced on my fiancé with a feisty, steely grit, her eyes like treacherous blue daggers. "You heard the man! Get out! Get out! Did you hear? Get out!" My fiancé's olive-skinned face grew as white as a sheet. The colour drained. She gave me a hostile look, stamped her foot like a petulant schoolkid, and then marched out of the hospital belligerently, in a huff, as if she was the one that had been hard done by. I never ever saw her again, although I was to learn that her name Anwar means liar, which in the circumstances is exceedingly apt. The nurse scurried towards me, her eyes brimming with tears. She reached out to hold my hand as she pulled a chair up to my bedside, and a lone silvery tear trickled down her cheek. She squeezed my hand tightly, reassuringly, looking into my eyes with a tender gentleness so lacking in my cold-blooded fiancé. "Are you all right?" she asked. I nodded. "What a horrible woman! You must forgive me for eavesdropping, but I overheard your conversation. I couldn't help it. Frankly, I'm so disgusted, repulsed, appalled even. How dare she talk to you like that? She was your fiancé, I take it. She ends your relationship after your dreadful skiing accident. I mean, how low can you get? Talk about kicking you in the guts." "Well, she doesn't want to spend her life with a cripple, does she? I suppose I can't blame her. It would seem being married to me would seriously compromise her future happiness." "That's ridiculous. She's ridiculous. But maybe she's done you a favour in the long term." "How's that?" "Well, she's shown you the grievous state of her heart, hasn't she? How selfish, self-centred and narcissistic she is. You can see her life only revolves around herself. Stuff anybody else. If she really loved you, she would marry you, even if you were completely paralysed from the waist down. Unconditional love has no barricades, no conditions, nor fixed terms. It just is. Your fiancé, well, she doesn't even have a heart. She's spineless. She's a snake in the grass." "I think you might be right there," I said. "Maybe I did dodge a bullet." "Oh, believe me, Mr. Hughes, you most certainly did," she said, giving me an encouraging nudge. "She might come in a pretty glitzy package that appears enticing and alluring, but believe me, the chocolate in the cellophane is seriously mouldy, hideously repugnant. completely inedible. Indeed, it was true. After my accident, I saw my fiancé, or ex-fiancé if you like, in a whole different light, as if seeing her for the very first time in a crowded room, in a blinding, sententious light that was so intense I could pick up all her flaws, rather reminding me of those scary UV photographs you get that show you the true hideous state of your skin, so that every bit of evidential sun damage is discernible to you. It was like I was seeing her through another very illuminating lens, rather like the eyes of God, that can see our hearts. This time I did not see the attractive woman with the long dark hair, fair skin and green eyes, for the veneer had been shoved to the side so forcefully, rather like the drapes on a window, and I got to see what was really on the inside. Needless to say, after an arduous year of intensive physical therapy, shooting physical pain, trauma counselling, along with a significant amount of checkups, I finally received a clean bill of health from my doctor. But returning to my former life as a firefighter was never going to happen. That part had been forever expunged from me. I felt a significant amount of bitterness in my life, possibly towards my ex-fiancé among other things, along with the unfortunate blows that the universe had dealt for me. So I punnelled all my energy into my father's business. Before he retired, he handed over the reins of the company to me, so I became the big boss, calling all the shots. The business in Los Angeles prospered, bearing an abundance of fruit, but I was very different, like an old dying tree. I'd lost the ardent passion and zealousness for life. Happiness eluded me, like a balloon on a string, floating into the azure blue sky, the string too far to reach. Little did I realize that I'd wrapped myself in a cocoon of self-preservation, to protect myself from being hurt again. I had earned a formidable reputation at work, as being a man of steel with a cold heart. It would seem that I would not let anyone into my soft personal space, for fear of being hurt again. One day a great friend of mine who was a firefighter called me up on the spot, encouraging me to go camping with him, in an area of wilderness in Northern California. "I haven't seen you for so long, Griffin, since we worked together 10 years ago. My, hasn't time flown by so fast, bro. We do need to reconnect. It's been far too long. I've really missed you." "It has been long," I agreed. "You won't have to go hiking on foot," he explained. "We'll go camping on horseback, so it's unlikely to be a problem for your leg. Go on, it'll do you good. Please, please say yes. I'm looking so forward to seeing you again." I didn't hesitate to say yes, as the very idea of camping in the wilderness was exceedingly appealing for me. It had been too long since my feet had padded the rich earthen trails of a verdant forest, and breathed in the fresh, crisp air of the mountains, or tasted the crisp, fresh water of a sparkling stream. The memories of those soulful experiences, and others like them, came flooding back to my mind, like a nostalgic fragrance I had not smelt for a very long time, like freshly mown grass, jasmine, or the smell of a pine forest. Stanley Finch was a man of few words, but when he spoke his mind, he wore his heart on his sleeve. "You've changed, bro," he said to me. "After your accident, something has died in you. That bright spark has all but faded." He informed me of this on the first night of our camping trip. We were relaxing by a fire pit outside of our tent, after having eaten some delicious barbecue ribs and pork tenderloin. "I've missed you, Griffin, but I can see life hasn't been good to you. You've become bitter, hard, cold. I know your ex-fiancé hurt you, as did the skiing accident, but there is no need to cover yourself in a protective bubble like this, or live in fear with such cynicism. That's not the Griffin I used to know. The old Griffin was fearless, passionate, enthusiastic, zealous. I'm not the man I once was," I admitted. "I'm a shadow of my former self. It doesn't help that I live in pain." Stanley looked at me in shock, his blue eyes registering concern. "I'm sorry, bro. I had no idea it was that bad. I hope your ride on Silver Birch this morning did not jolt you, or exacerbate any old injuries. You must tell me if your leg is hurting." Funny enough, the ride was pleasantly smooth, I assured him. "My leg pain is incongruous. I might be fine for a couple of days, and then suddenly, when I'm dictating a letter to my secretary, I'll be hit with these violent shooting spasms. I've learnt to live with the pain, manage it somehow." "That's terrible, bro. I'm sorry." He paused for a moment and said, "What about women? Are there any significant others in your life?" "Oh, that," I pooh-poohed, trying my level best to avoid such a direct, uncomfortable, confrontational question that I also didn't want to confront. "I've not had time to date. I'm too busy, I expect, involved in running my father's company. Business is good, very good." "But you're not, are you?" asked Stanley, looking at me fixedly. "It sounds to me as if running a successful company is a great source of distraction for you, so that you're far too busy to have a life beyond the office. You know what I think? I think you're scared to date." He said that looking at me sadly. "That bloody narcissistic ex-fiancé of yours obliterated all your confidence. I promise you, bro, take it from me, not all women are cast from the same mould. There are good ones out there. I promise, as hard as that is to believe. I'm not sure most women want to date a cripple." "Don't be ridiculous, Griffin. You've got a dodgy leg, for goodness sake. And even if you were crippled, why should that be a setback for you in finding a good woman? Do you remember Ralph Batterskew?" "I do. Very nice character." "Well, he ended up paralysed from the waist down from an injury when he was rescuing a young girl from a burning building. Moments after he saved her life, the scaffolding on the second floor collapsed. He sustained one heck of a nasty fall, poor man." "Oh, I am sorry to hear that," I said. "That does sound frightful." "Well, he got married last year. He has a wife and is very much in love. You could do the same, Griffin. Open your heart to a good woman. You don't want to be alone for the rest of your life, surely." "You make a good point, Stanley. I'll think about it," I said. "Please do, bro. You deserve to be very happy. But more to the point, I want you to be happy. I want to see the old spark return in your eyes. I do have an alternative motive for bringing you here, I have to confess," he said, grinning at me. "You do?" I asked, looking perturbed. I groaned. "Oh, no. You haven't gone and set me up with an absurd date, have you? I hope you haven't." "Of course not. Let me explain. There was a wildfire not far from here, which took us days to extinguish. It was quite an inferno. A nightmare to control, let me tell you. One of the firefighters, Keith, claimed to have seen 2 Bigfoot running away from the location of the wildfire. I took it upon myself to examine the rural geography of the area. In my opinion, we're both camping in the heart of Bigfoot territory. I'm pretty certain the Bigfoots would have relocated to this spot, after the wildfire, that is, given the topography of the area, the close access to fresh water and food sources." At Stanley's earnest expression, along with the excited glaze in his eyes, I couldn't stop myself from laughing. "You brought me here in the hope we might encounter a Bigfoot. Now that's borderline insane, bro." "That's exactly why I brought you here," said Stanley, grinning. "It's not just Keith that had a sighting of a Bigfoot. A few of the other dudes I work with had fleeting glances of the creature at various other wildfire locations. But never ever me. Can you believe it? Never me. The very one that wants a sighting more than anyone else. Well, it completely eludes me. I mean, how unfortunate do you have to get?" I grinned. "Maybe you're looking too hard," I teased. Stanley's expression was serious as his eyes meditated on the flames in the fire pit. "It's something I've always wanted," he said longingly. "An encounter with the hairy man himself. I'm not exactly sure why. I can't even fathom this enigmatic longing that I have." "But why?" I asked. "From what I gather, not all encounters are benevolent. You run the risk of encountering a belligerent territorial Bigfoot who could potentially be quite dangerous. Believe me, I've heard stories, scary stories, that I shall not repeat to you. That's a risk I'm willing to take. I'm of the opinion that these creatures are as individualistic as human beings. Look at the one in the picture taken at Bluff Creek all those long years ago. Anyone could see that that was not an aggressive critter. The poor thing, she couldn't get away fast enough. I almost felt sorry for her. She clearly wasn't thrilled to have been spotted. I can't say I blame her. So you decided to bring along your friend with a gammy leg for a Bigfoot adventure. Is that right? I teased. Why not? I certainly don't see you as a cripple. And even if I did, I'd still invite you. You've always been open to a good adventure. And Bigfoot, dude, it ain't going to get better than that. You do realise, Stanley, that Bigfoots are exceedingly elusive. Most sightings are so random, fleeting. I suspect that unless they're aggressive like an elephant in musk, looking for a fight or a confrontation with a human, you are very unlikely to see one. In my opinion, the vast majority of Bigfoots are just going to disappear into the ether.
Well, let's hope you're wrong about that, said Stanley, piling onto the open grill a whole pile of bacon rashers. I raised a questionable brow. What are you doing, Stan? We've only just eaten. Shouldn't you be saving all that delicious, lovely bacon for breakfast tomorrow? I happen to have it on good authority that the smell of fried bacon is a drawing card for a Bigfoot, which is why I'm cooking it. It might help to get a Bigfoot to come to us, not the other way round. Bacon is the perfect bait. I smiled at my friend Riley. Stanley always had faith in the impossible. I certainly admired his ardent determination to encounter a Bigfoot, but I seriously doubted his efforts would be rewarded. I bit my lip, refraining myself from discouraging him, as that would be very cruel. But in truth I doubted his chances of success, for stumbling upon such an ambiguous, transient, fugacious creature, as elusive as the Scarlet Pimpernel, was exceedingly unlikely. We were camped in a northeastern part of California, bordering Oregon and Nevada, a secret location that was privy to a few rather spectacular, ancient, abandoned, and long since forgotten hiking and horse riding trails that were barely ever used, or possibly even known about by the public. We had hitched up our tents around a silvery lake, on the edge of a flowery meadow, bordered by sagebrush, where two of Stanley's beloved black and bay horses, Silver Birch and Firecracker, were grazing away happily to their heart's content. In the long distance you could see the smouldering silhouettes of the undulating mountains that shimmered and gleamed under a cobalt-blue sky. The pyramid shapes of the ponderosa pines and Douglas firs clustered around the valley in a very grandiose electric green ensemble, rather like prominent celestial beings gathering together for an important meeting. The day had folded away so fast, like the pages of a book being swiftly turned. For the first time in ages I was resonating with the wilderness, breathing in her crisp fresh air, marvelling in the sensation of the fresh breeze blowing against my skin, transfixed by the magnificence of her beguiling allure. For so long the scenery of my office had all but depicted four plain walls, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking one of Los Angeles' busy, bustling streets, along with a cheap, tarty picture of a calendar girl in a bikini that someone had put on my wall as their idea of a joke, possibly to get some kind of a rise out of their stiff boss. But I had absolutely no intention of giving them the satisfaction, so I had wilfully ignored it, and now the buckling, bedraggled calendar had been on my wall for over 8 years. The valley was now bathed in a resplendent, velvety black sky, superbly offset by the twinkling jewels of the silvery stars, along with the bright luminescence of a dazzling full moon. The sounds of crickets, frogs, and the occasional howl of a coyote or wolf serenaded the night with their reassuring symphonies, while the fresh scent of butterscotch, pine, sage, intermingled with wild flowers, appeared so much more pronounced on this magical evening, now heightening their floral bouquet with delicious smoky smells that travelled on the breeze like a wispy feather, the quintessential pulling card for a Bigfoot, so we hoped. Before long our eyelids became droopy as our conversation waned, drifting away like two disembodied ghostly voices caught on the wind. We knew then that sleep was graciously inviting us to embrace the world of our dreams. We needed little encouragement, so we hit our sleeping bags hard, with the fervour of two drunken men soon drifting off into a deep sleep. I awoke with a start, sitting bolt upright, my body trembling. I'd heard a noise. I was certain there were large feet trudging around our campsite,
Of the bipedal kind, that is. I did not feel excitement of any kind, but a feeling of dread, as terrifying chills shot down my spine in a nervous frenzy, while sweat began to break out on my brow. My fingers and hands became clammy. I glanced over to Stanley, who was snoring very loudly, oblivious to what was going on. But if that wasn't weird enough, my friend's snores were being replicated by something or someone outside our tent, who was making the same snoring sounds as Stanley. Was there some loony outside our tent trying to make fun of Stanley's snores, I wondered. It was so hard to wake the man up, even after shaking him briskly for a while. He just groaned, rolled over, continued to sleep, and ignored me, so unresponsive to my desperate attempts to wake him up. "Bigfoot," I piped. "Bigfoot! Bigfoot! Bigfoot!" I knew those words would rouse him from his slumber, like a sleeping dog hearing the words, "Steak dinner, steak dinner, steak dinner." "Bigfoot," he said, sitting bolt up, bouncing out of his foggy state like an exuberant puppy dog. "Where? Where?" The excitement on his face was bubbling over like a pot of peas on the cooker. "I only said that to wake you up," I said. "There's something outside of our tent. It might be a weirdo. It's copying your snoring. Listen." "It was copying me snoring," said Stanley, growing even more exuberant. "It just might be a Bigfoot if that's the case. They mimic everything." The sound of heavy thumping footfall, accompanied by the snapping of crunching twigs and leaves, was very discernible. The ponderous, rather alarming footsteps around our campsite became so much more pronounced, and way too close for comfort. This haunting revelation did not bode well with me, knowing something monstrously huge was in our midst, something predatory, dangerous, frightening. The rising level of trepidation I felt had momentarily been expunged by a few sharp shooting pains in my leg that were taking off like fireworks, but were barely noticed by me. The footsteps suddenly stopped, as if the owner of the feet was standing very still. All of a sudden, the banging of the cast-iron grill from the fire pit could be heard, being crashed around like dirty dishes in a sink, washed by a pair of clumsy hands. Whoever was out there was meddling around with the fire pit, and they were not doing a good job in remaining discreet. "The bacon," I whispered. "Did you leave it on the grill?" "Of course I did," said Stanley. "I told you, didn't I? It's the perfect bait." All of a sudden we heard a thundering echo in the woods, moving towards our campsite, as feet bounded towards our tent. Every thunderous footstep of the approaching entity, whatever on earth it was, seemed to make the ground quiver, heave, shake, under what must have been a substantial, sizable weight, which led me to swiftly conclude that we did indeed have a couple of Bigfoots in our midst, as who else or what else could pound the ground with such a forceful power, other than an elephant or a rhino. Whatever this thing was, it was clearly bipedal. Stanley reached for his rifle, nodding to me. "I'm just going to take a peek outside," he said, giving me a thrilled, cheeky look, like a boy who'd caught the girl across the road in a compromising position. "I think we have 2 Bigfoots outside our tent," he whispered excitedly. "Are you stark raving mad?" Stanley, I protested. "You're going out there, leaving me in here, all on my own, to the mercy of the wolves? Are you kidding me?" Stanley did not listen. His focus was intense. He stealthily unzipped the door of the tent, cautiously creeping out of the opening, with me following close behind him. I had no intention of staying in my tent, like a banana in its skin, waiting to be pulled apart and devoured. I'd rather know what it was we were facing than hanker down low in the tent and just wait and see. Then we saw them. Nothing prepares you for seeing 2 incongruous creatures like this in our reality. Me and Stanley stood very still. We watched the scene unfolding before our very eyes, hardly daring to even draw breath, in case it should draw attention to us. It was like we were watching a movie. It was all so bizarre, so surreal. We could see 2 Bigfoots, one significantly smaller than the other. The smaller one, which I imagine was the former creature that had previously impersonated Stanley's snores, was sitting opposite our fire pit, with the cast-iron grill in his oversized hands. His pink tongue was licking the vertical iron ridges of the grill, rather like a popsicle. I assume he must have eaten all the bacon, and couldn't get enough of the delicious salty, smoky flavours. The larger Bigfoot, who was clearly female, based on her feminine heart-shaped face and low-slung breasts, had clearly only recently arrived on the scene. She was evidently trying her damnedest to evacuate her belligerent son from our camping location, which she regarded with the same level of angst and trepidation that I'd only been feeling moments before. She was possibly all too well aware that humans could carry rifles, could be reactive and threatening, not always to be trusted. It would seem that her youngling, who was not small by any manner of means, but clearly a juvenile, was impetuous, headstrong, and wilful. He had been surreptitiously lured away from his mother's charge by the delicious aroma of smoky bacon. I imagine he'd sneaked away on hot pursuit of the delicious smell. The mother wasn't at all happy with her son, who in her opinion, I imagine, she perceived was uncomfortably far too close to a human camping site for her liking. Her obstinate youngling was having none of it, as his tongue was almost superglued to that grill. I could feel every inch of the mother's level of annoyance as she studied her son with an expression of exasperation in her deep-set, treacle-coloured eyes. She was no different to any other weary mother, being bugged over and over again by her demanding child in a store, begging her to buy the candy bars, and being unrelenting in the process. In truth, I was rather surprised I didn't feel fear, but then again, how could I? In truth, the pertinent interaction between mother and son was so intrinsically human, so incredibly relatable, that I could actually perceive exactly what was going on, like an open book. The mother was about 6.5 foot tall, approximately 500 pounds, a very powerful sturdy build, muscular body, exceedingly long arms. I noticed her cone-shaped head flowed into a large pair of shoulders seamlessly, while her whole body was covered in dark brown, long flowing hair. Her son, on the other hand, was as tall as her, but long, lean and lanky, like a skinny teenager that has not filled out yet into his own body, but his energy was exceedingly juvenile. The mother was eyeing her son, with a grievous, despairing look of indignation and frustration on her face. She was trying desperately to pull him away from the grill with her overlong arms, but he firmly stood his ground, wilfully refusing to budge an inch. She was talking to him in a low tone, like a human whisper, obviously perceiving that 2 sleeping campers might be awoken if she was to raise her voice in any way. I'm glad to say she was obliviously unaware that she was being watched, as all her focus was completely on her son. Finally, the mother had reached the point of no return. Enough was enough. Her patience had worn thin. She grabbed the grill from the surprised youngling, who let out a little warning growl to his mother, like a small, snappy dog. The mother ran with our grill in her arms into the woods, the smaller Bigfoot running after her, screaming loudly. It was a clever ploy to get her child away from the campsite, I imagine. We watched in reverent awe as the 2 creatures glided away. Believe me, I have no explanation for this, but they looked like they floated, even though the ground heaved under their weight. For a moment Stanley stood still, not saying a thing, staring at me, his eyes as wide as saucers. "Oh my God," he said. We saw a Bigfoot." He looked like a boy who had been given a train set at Christmas and could not wipe the ecstatic grin off his face. "Correction," I said. "We saw 2 Bigfoot, a mother and her youngling, who was almost as big as her." "I can't believe it," said Stanley, clasping his hands over his mouth. "I can't bloody believe it. Did you see how beautiful they were? How intelligent? Oh my God! I'm so happy, bro. So happy." I nodded. "They were beautiful," I said. "It's beyond me how anyone could kill a Bigfoot. They're so human." Needless to say, we discovered the following morning after we awoke from another sleep that the grill had surreptitiously been replaced and returned to our fire pit, almost as if nothing had happened, although the grill was completely clean. If we had not witnessed the absurd interaction between a mother and her youngling, we would have been none the wiser. It is without a shadow of a doubt in my mind that this event with a Bigfoot changed my life in more ways than you can ever imagine. It was like the locked, bolted door to my heart had been opened, as if the prisoner, that was me, hiding behind the closed door, had suddenly peered out from behind the wooden barricades for the very first time, rather like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon, embracing the world with a joyful new resolve, ever glad to have left the confines of its silken imprisonment. For so long my emotions had been frozen, as keeping the painful memories of my past in this solid, hardened state meant I could pretend that they weren't there, rather like the leg of lamb sitting at the bottom of the freezer that you clean forgot about. Slowly and surely the sun had risen over the horizon of my life, casting its golden shadows over my frozen inner world. The ice was beginning to melt away, while green shoots of recovery were budding, emerging like spring flowers bursting through the ground. Suddenly everything for me seemed brighter. I was happier now, more open to becoming the man I once was. It would seem that even my company employees no longer recognized the big boss, who was formerly cold, abrasive, unfriendly. But now I was different, very different. It was my secretary who'd been working for me tirelessly for over 5 long years that turned around to me and said, "Mr. Hughes, I don't know what's happened to you, but you went away for a weekend, and well, you've come back, and you're different. You're actually nice, very nice. I always suspected that you were really rather nice, but you just didn't show it very well." I looked at my secretary for the first time in 5 years, the 5 years that she had worked for me. Before that I'd barely acknowledged her, barked out orders, given her long to-do lists, but she was like a beautiful flower in the meadow that had been willfully ignored by me. But suddenly my eyes had been opened, as the walls of protection around my heart came crumbling down. I kid you not, within days, and I mean days, I'd asked my secretary to be my wife. I never looked back now. I'm such a happily married man, with 3 wonderful children, and I couldn't be happier. So there you are. That's my story. It's freezing out of doors. I lie comfortably trussed up in my bed, tangled up beneath the magnanimous layers of thick bedding, to lock in as much heat as possible. But the ponderous presence of my large mountain dog Dallas, who lies at my feet, has become for me a sizable bed warmer that I appreciate on these long drawn-out, painfully cold winter nights, where I live in Alaska, otherwise known as the last frontier of the northwestern region of the United States, of which it is the largest state. If my husband were here, he'd not be remotely impressed to see that in his fortuitous absence from our cabin, that Dallas has been promoted from sleeping in the kitchen's doggy basket, large enough to fit a cheetah, to lying at the bottom of our marital king-sized bed, where his soft big head rests over my feet, and I love feeling him close to me. I hasten to say, if I could masterfully engineer a hot water bottle like Dallas to bring to market, I would be rich indeed, especially in these parts, as your regular hot water bottle would become obsolete, as Dallas provides an ongoing warmth that never ever subsides. Ostensibly, my cabin has become subdued and quiet of late, almost as if this inanimate home of ours can sense that something is not as it should be, and is amiss, rather like a chessboard that is missing one of its pieces, or a pack of cards that has lost its queens. If you live in this part of the world, you become fully acquainted to miserably icy cold conditions like this, and many don't cope with the perilously aggressive weather here. As a consequence, there is a high rate of depression and alcohol addiction in Alaska, not to mention drugs, as the threatening fearsome cold weather can drop to about -54 degrees Celsius in winter. It has also been known to get people to feel rarely downcast and sometimes ridden by desperate despair. I believe they call it seasonal depressive disorder, or something like that. I know so many people here who actively engage in light therapy treatments during the painfully dark winter months, to lift them out of their lugubrious melancholia, and some of them have been flung out of their depression so fast, like a stone in a slingshot, as the light therapy works remarkably well, and has helped many alcoholics kick their addiction for good, nipping it fully in the bud. If you go to other areas in the world, where they're exposed to much light all year round, you don't get the level of depression we find here in Alaska, which I believe is self-explanatory within itself. By all accounts, I believe the issues that plague most of us here living in Alaska are ultimately related to the light frequency here. It gets dark here during the winter months, taking a long time for the sun to rise in the mornings. That I suspect is part of the intrinsic problem as to why it's so easy to slink into a downcast state. Suffice to say, when days are quickly plunged into darkness, when so much daylight is cruelly expunged, it's obviously not easy for people to bustle along steadily with their lives when they're not feeling their level best. Even though I've lived here all my life, you never fully get used to the icy Arctic temperatures in Alaska, and if you claim you do, I suspect you're doing a great job at lying. Predictably, I use the wood-burning stove in the family cabin, continuously burning away all day and night. It's designed to keep the place toasty and warm. I use the traditional heating sources that go back to the good old days. I also have an oil-fired oven that warms up the kitchen like an old English aga, and I have a couple of fireplaces in the cabin. The trouble is, without the wood-burning stove being fastidiously attended to during the night, the fire quickly dies down, once it has hungrily devoured the wood and coal, so that all that is left behind are the sad grey ashes and the smouldering embers. This means, of course, that the temperature dips significantly, especially in my own marital bedroom, which is situated at the far end of the passage, so that any heat circulating in the cabin seems to unfailingly, wantonly abandon the master bedroom. I suspect it just simply cannot stretch that far, rather like a kid that cannot reach the cookie jar on the upper shelf in the kitchen. The master bedroom is not very big on purpose, as heat disperses too quickly over a large spatial area, which was why my father, who first built the cabin when he was a young man, designed it this way, so that keeping the rooms relatively small meant they maintained a cosy warmth for those cruel, unrelenting winter days that simply know not the meaning of the word mercy. Indeed, it can be so insufferably cold that you may want to hibernate under your bed covers like a black bear and wake up when the spring announces her illustrious presence. Believe me, there is nothing more spectacular and beguiling than Alaska in spring and summer. It's at this prepossessing time of year that you can be forgiven for thinking you have literally died and gone to heaven. The landscape is absolutely mesmerizing. The sky an almost perfect cup of blue. And then there's the signature of the brooding summits that ascend the sky like voluptuous shapely ladies, all wearing white bowling hats. It is spectacular to behold, making your heart melt like butter over a warm bagel. I have physically gasped in awe at the beauty that surrounds me at these warmer times of the year, and am ever mindful of the marvellous privileges I thoroughly enjoy, living in this transfixing, beautiful and idyllic paradise, which is both natural and completely unspoilt. Alaska boasts over 19 mountain peaks that rise up to 14,000 feet high, coastline, volcanoes, over 100,000 glaciers, lakes and highway passes, and of course, let's not forget, vast stretches of open tundra. And while Alaska may be intimidating based on its vast size, it will almost certainly touch your heart like no other place on earth. Getting back to the specifics of the family cabin, the master bedroom I share with my husband George boasts a magnanimous king-size bed, 2 side tables, a walnut bureau, and a large closet. It's a rudimentary basic room, I know, but I try my level best to make it look as homely and snug as possible by inviting colour to swathe the beds and placing some interesting works of art on the walls and rugs on the floor, always involving as much colour as possible, which brings brightness to our lives, especially over the winter months. I personally cannot stand drab works of art that offer little inspiration. My bedroom is a continuous work in progress. I keep adding more to it to give it that personalised lived-in feeling that makes the family cabin a sumptuous home, but I always avoid cluttering the place up, as too much stuff means you get tangled up in chaos and can potentially become a prisoner in your own home, enslaved by your worldly possessions, and I personally couldn't live like that. My daughter Ruth calls my fussing around the cabin as a natural nesting instinct. The birds might do it in spring, as they eagerly prepare their nests for their new fledglings. But I have been accused of doing it all year round, and I suspect I'm guilty as charged, as I love to make the cabin look as wholesome as I possibly can. I've had visitors staying in my cabin before, who live in large glamorous houses in Long Island, and they're envious of my family's small cabin. But I tell them that large or small, you can make any place a comfortable home, if you put your loving signature on the place, which is what I've done to our cabin. To all intents and purposes, one side of our luxuriously cosy king-size bed was until recently always occupied at night by the presence of my beloved, burly, big, tall, lanky, thoroughbred Alaskan husband, whom I miss dreadfully. He's like a big, cuddly teddy bear to me, and kept the bed so lovely and sumptuously warm because of his large size. How I wish he was here with me now. The cabin feels vacuously empty without him. Alas, his side of the bed has been cold and empty for 2 weeks now, and every time I reach out to touch it, I am rudely reminded he is no longer here. But to date I have no idea where he is, and the police are equally as bereft about his cryptic, incomprehensible disappearance. This enigmatic, perplexing and inscrutable conundrum I find myself in has been eating me up alive, as my husband would never willingly go missing or leave me to live out my life in this lonesome cabin all on my own. We did everything together as a couple, especially after our 2 grown-up kids left home. My husband George is used to working hard out of doors and overcoming the adversities of living in a tough, formidable climate like this. We live about 2 hours away from Anchorage, and so we do a weekly shop in town to refresh all our supplies. I always enjoy visiting the town, getting my hair done, eating at a restaurant, and doing a little shopping. Believe me when I say, living in the sticks like this is not for the faint of heart, by any manner of means. Many intrepid explorers have come to Alaska with the full intention of settling down here, falsely assuming that they can easily do it. I mean, how hard can it actually be, right? Sometimes the soul-destroying winters unabashedly defeat them of their good intentions and well-meaning resolve to stay here. So they scurry hurriedly away from our part of the world, like a pack of frightened mice, as Alaska is not for everyone, and I'm the first to completely understand that. My husband has always had the courage of a lion, the tenacity of a mountain goat, and there has never been much that would get him down or conquer his upbeat approach to life. So what happened to him, you may ask? I wish I knew the answer to that baffling question. He disappeared in the Alaskan Triangle region, which has an ominous reputation for people going missing every year, and no one knows what happened to these people, as not a trace of them can be found. But believe me, all kinds of speculations abound as to how and why these people seemingly vanish into thin air. The Alaskan Triangle is a site of unusual magnetic activity, so theories poke away at people's ideas, and many believe the missing were abducted by aliens or attacked and killed by wild animals, taken by strange cryptic creatures like Bigfoot or the Kushtaka. You name it, the rumours abound, of which there are too many to count. But no one has the answers, and that is the big problem. Some will say that it's such a vast tundra of unpredictable, wild, uncharted wilderness that it's inevitable every year for people to go missing in the Alaskan Triangle. But how do you explain those who vanish before your very eyes, which is exactly what happened to my husband? I feel in some way responsible for my husband's disappearance, as strange as that may sound, as I was the one that persuaded my husband to help out his friend Marcus, who was like a brother to the both of us, and so helping Marcus was like helping a family, and that's what you do out here. Marcus is a precious, beloved friend to our family, and is the godfather to my 25-year-old daughter Ruth. Marcus grew up with my husband in Anchorage, Alaska. They were bosom buddies from day one, both attending the same kindergartens and schools together. Marcus's family owned 8 dogs, and when Marcus was a boy, he adored animals of every kind, and had a special attachment towards dogs. He decided he wanted to work with huskies when he got older, to make a living offering sleigh rides to tourists, as well as teaching obedience training to dog owners and puppy training courses. No one doubted for a single moment this was the path he would ultimately take. He had never been one of those kids that wavered from being desirous to being a fireman one week and a pilot the next. It would seem from 9 years of age, Marcus knew the path he would take in his life. He would say to me unequivocally, "When I'm big, I'm going to work with dogs." Let's just say as a native-born Alaskan, the idea of living anywhere else in the world was nonsensical for him, as Marcus belongs to the Alaskan wilderness as the snow belongs on the vast stretches of sprawling tundra. My strange, inscrutable story begins when Marcus unfortunately caught a bad bout of pneumonia, which rudely confiscated his ability to work. He was completely bedbound, with sky-high temperatures, and an incapacitating weakness, which meant even walking from the bed to the bathroom was a major physical struggle and challenge. Naturally, my husband did not want Marcus to lose out on his sleigh ride bookings with the tourists and have his income significantly slashed. He had worked with Marcus's dogs before on many occasions, and he knew the quintessential ropes of the business, so he eagerly volunteered to help Marcus out, while he was otherwise indisposed. As you can imagine, Marcus was exceedingly grateful for my husband's help and intervention, which would help him not lose out some valuable income that the tourist industry generates for Alaskans every year. My husband and I have our own business that we run from home, so I could easily man the fort while he was away. People out here like to help each other out when needs must, as in tough times offering a helping hand goes a long way with the territory of living in an austere, inhospitable part of the world that can be cheerlessly unforgiving at the very best of times, and I don't say that remotely lightly. Let's just say, in the paradoxical case of my husband George, it would seem the saying that no good deed goes unpunished was alarmingly apt in this particular idiosyncratic set of profoundly bizarre circumstances that would leave us completely spellbound, bewildered, nonplussed, befuddled, confounded, and knocked off our pedestals, as we pondered as to what had become of him. I couldn't bear to see the pitiful looks I got from friends and family alike, even my own children, who felt desperately sorry for my plight. All I cared about was getting my husband back, as even though he was missing, I didn't believe for a moment he was dead. Others clearly thought he was, as I could see the sorrowful, doleful, woeful looks in their melancholic eyes that they desperately tried to hide from me. But I'm quick to read people's body language. I knew what most folk were thinking out here. Suffice to say their unarticulated words rang true in my head, as loudly as an obnoxious church bell that wouldn't shut up. "He's never coming back. He's never coming back. He's never coming back," they whispered rudely into my mind, without the spoken word ever being expressed. But those mute, blurred, fatuous words hung pertinently in my head, like the clothes in a wardrobe that you cannot wear because they are either too small or too large, as something did not fit about my husband's strange vanishing. I refused to believe that he was no more. I think the local folk were perturbed that I remained optimistically upbeat when I kept saying, "I know he's coming back, I just do." I think they thought I was desperately naive. Revealingly, even my own son Adam was tirelessly telling me to stop being so unrealistic. "Mum, you need to accept the fact that Dad is not coming back. You know this is true. You have to accept it. I know it's hard, but it's very rare for missing people that go missing in the Alaskan Triangle to ever be found again." "But I know he's not dead," I told my son. "If he were gone, I would feel it inside." "Oh, Mum, you're being so naive. You've lived in Alaska all your life. You know how unforgiving this part of the world is. It's likely Dad was attacked and eaten by a wild animal. I know it's cruel, but it's probably what happened." "But he's not dead," I insisted. It infuriated Adam greatly when I told him that his father was coming back. "Oh, Mum, you're driving me insane," he said obsequiously. "I don't want you to delude yourself. It's terrible to have lost Dad. It is, of course it is. We're all hurting very much. But we can't brood over his disappearance like this. We need to let it go, Mum." "I'll never let your father go, Adam," I told him adamantly. "And he is coming back. I know he is. I feel it in my heart." "Oh, Mum, what am I going to do with you?" Adam groaned.
You're a perennial optimist, you are, and I admire you for that, I do. But sometimes you need to face the truth. The truth is, Adam, I'm never going to convince you that my intuition is incredibly reliable. It has never failed me yet. If your father were dead, I would absolutely, unequivocally know it in my heart. But I sense he's still very much alive. Why should I doubt my intuition? Back to how my husband vanished. My husband George, as I was saying, was very familiar with Marcus's dogs, and knew how to take good care of them. And they responded to his orders well, and were attached to him, as second in command, so to speak. You could say it was no big deal for my husband to take over the reins for a while, and Marcus knew that his dogs would be in very good hands. "You're good to me, bro," he said to my husband. "I can't thank you enough for helping me out." He was not to know that this would be the last time he would see his best friend, and even when George left our cabin for a week away, I never knew I was kissing my husband for the last time. Had I known this, I would refuse to let him go. He had given me a cheeky grin and said, "I think I'm going to enjoy Marcus's job this week. It'll be a good change. Besides, it'll be fun working with those dogs again, especially Snowdrop. That dog, for some reason, always makes me smile. He's won my heart over, he has." Those were my husband's famous last words, so they continually hung around in my head, like an old coat in the entrance hall, that I kept putting on over and over again, in order to re-engage with those wistful memories that now had become as nostalgic to me as the memories of my late parents, who were tragically killed in a small plane crash in Alaska, and who had left the cabin in my careful charge. So undisputedly, life had been hard on the all of us, but we eagerly embraced it nevertheless, as that's what living is all about. It must have been on the third day when my husband was out with the dogs in an area of the Alaskan Triangle, bounded by the lines between Anchorage, Juneau, and Utkavek, that was once known as Barrow, which encompasses 10,000 miles of harsh terrain, with bitterly cold temperatures in winter and long periods of darkness, which is the norm. It had begun like any ordinary day, with nothing untoward in the air, or any sense of prognostication on anyone's parts that would lend suggestion that anything would potentially go badly awry. My husband was taking these Scandinavian tourists, who were very good friends, sledding, or otherwise known by many as mushing, in an idyllic snow-covered area in the Alaskan Triangle, which was something they always wanted to do. The tourists eagerly explained to the police that it had been a particularly beautiful day. They were all incredibly excited about going sledding, and the upbeat mood was infectious. By all accounts, they were having a whopping time together, laughing and talking spiritedly, with their voices echoing across the long, sprawling white expanse of open tundra. Everything was going swimmingly well, and the dogs were probably enjoying themselves even more than the tourists, as they trotted in twos, one pair of dogs behind another, in a fluid musical sequence. They ran seamlessly across the snow, happily wagging their tails and pulling the sled along behind them at a fast speed that was both exhilarating and invigorating, especially for the tourists who had never been sledding before. The atmosphere appeared to be charmed. A soft ethereal light shimmered across the snow-covered wilderness, but the light seemed almost bluish, and no one had seen a mysterious light like that before, fluidly casting a bluish tinge over the snow-covered tundra. It caught everyone off guard, and although very attractive, there was something about it that made many of the tourists feel instinctively on edge, and ever so slightly apprehensive, although why they felt like this, they simply could not explain. All of a sudden the dogs began to whimper, and behave peculiarly strangely, which flummoxed my husband, as he had never seen such incongruous, unorthodox behaviour being exhibited by the dogs before, who were normally quite mellow by nature. Presumably, if such a strange event had occurred before at some point, there is no doubt Marcus would have shared the strange anomaly with my husband. Marcus had been sledding in these parts for many years. It was profoundly odd, as the dogs seemed to be shaking with terror and refusing to go any further, stopping dead in their tracks on the snow, with tails hanging between their legs and ears cast backwards. They began to wail and whine, as if they sensed they were in the presence of a deadly predator that might just tear them apart limb from limb. The dogs had a greater understanding and comprehension of what they were sensing, compared to the party of human beings riding the sled, that were a little bemused and confounded by the strange behaviour from the dogs. The tourists began to describe an inauspicious airy feeling, overcoming them like a tsunami of dread, not because of the huskies, of course, and their obvious distress, although I dare say that didn't help the sombre, bodeful mood the moment engendered, that had descended upon them like an odorous bad smell. The description the Scandinavian tourists gave the police investigating my husband's strange disappearance was that something was profoundly off. One of the female tourists, called Bridget, told the detective that she knew something was about to go terribly awry. She could feel a malevolent energy in the air that was so tangible and so palpable that you could almost taste it on your tongue. She said it was as if you could astutely discern that you were in abject danger, rather like a deer sensing the presence of a mountain lion, or a cougar perhaps, both on its trail, and you knew you needed to get the hell out of there. It would seem the sleigh dogs were anchored to the spot, rigidly refusing to move forwards, and their long hair was quivering and shaking. Bridget said that every nerve in her body began to spike with adrenaline, and her heart thundered and boomed in her chest, and the other tourists described similar feelings of restless uneasiness that gnawed at them tirelessly, along with a dreadful feeling of being watched all the time, even though it would seem nothing was visibly there, that they could discernibly see with the naked eye. All of a sudden a thick, clawing, white, misty fog descended upon all of them so ruthlessly from every side, and came out from nowhere like a wall of white carpet, so you couldn't see a thing. Everyone became alarmingly scared, remaining nervously rooted to the spot, as they waited impatiently for the mist to abate. But according to these Scandinavian tourists, they were absolutely adamant that the mist felt intrinsically evil, and within the creeping mist they heard disembodied, haunting, unearthly sounds that were so spine-chilling that one of the terrified tourists fainted on the spot. She was unduly distressed. My husband tried to calm the tourist down, who was trembling violently like a blancmange jelly. "There's something in the mist! There's something there! There's something in the mist! Can't you see it? What if it's after us? What if it's going to hurt us? It's not good! I know it's not good!" The tourists said they could see blurry grey silhouettes moving in the mist like ghostly entities, and could sense eyes burning and burrowing into them. But it was all so ambiguously vague, so obscure, that after the event they wondered if they'd seen anything at all, and began to doubt their own accounts and fleeting observations, which is what you invariably tend to do in a strange set of circumstances that does not fit comfortably well with your paradigm of the world as you know it. There was no doubt that something unfathomable was going on. One thing the tourists felt unanimous about was as if they were being surrounded on every side by menacing eyes that bored into them as a feeling of being watched refused to abate. My naturally inquisitive husband George called out into the mist, "Hey there! What's going on? Hello there! Can you hear me? Hello!" He walked into the mist, even though the woman that had fainted was crying out to him, "George, please don't go in there! Don't go into the mist! There's something bad in the mist!" But nevertheless, despite the heedful warnings from everyone, my typically mulish, stubborn husband decided to investigate, and no one was remotely happy about his fortuitous, rather rash decision. Everything went airily quiet, and everyone called out for him to come back, but my husband did not respond to them. The heavy, clawing mists dissipated. The blue light shimmering across the tundra remained for a couple of minutes, and then disappeared, and my husband had vanished. There was no sighting of him anywhere, but everyone was adamant that something was in that mist, watching them, and whatever it was evil. But now that it had gone, it was almost as if it had been a bad dream. My husband was nowhere to be found. He had been there 1 minute, gone the next, walked through the mist like the curtains at a theatre, to be gone again, like a rabbit in a magician's hat that vaporizes before your very eyes in a wisp of smoke. The Scandinavians believed something was in that mist, and that something was responsible for taking my husband. No one could make any sense of the strange, cryptic experience, and Marcus's sleigh dogs were traumatized for an entire week But a week later it was like their minds had been wiped clean of their bad experience, as if they had no memory of it at all, which was also incredibly strange. The police had kept me updated, but the news was always exactly the same. "There are no new developments into the disappearance of your husband, I'm afraid," they told me again and again, and began to sound like a broken record, and the look in their eyes told me all I needed to know. It was unlikely they would make any progress on this missing persons investigation, as weird events like this had been happening here in Alaska for years. The stories might have been different, but the results were consequently the same. The person seemed to have vanished into thin air. A few days after my husband's rather peculiar disappearance, I was put in touch with a woman from Nebraska who was currently staying in Anchorage with relatives and had recently experienced something quite similar to what had happened to my husband, and her story also happened in the Alaskan Triangle, much like my husband's story had done, and the similarities between our two stories literally took my breath away. The woman's name was Jazz Fallenstone, and she had longed to visit Alaska, which was why she was actually on this trip. She drove down a long sequestered road, covered in snow, surrounded by vast areas of snow-covered wilderness and tundra on every side. The sky was becoming quite grey and overcast-looking, which wasn't unusual when the light begins to fade. There were 3 people in the back of the rental truck that they had hired together. By all accounts, Jazz's husband Paulie was sitting by her side on the passenger seat in the front of the truck. Unfortunately, he was not allowed to drive. He occasionally got seizures, but was on medication to keep them under control, and had not had a seizure since, so things were looking up in regards to his health, although doctors could not find the catalyst for his seizures, and considered his condition a mystery. Jazz continued driving along the road, and everyone was singing happily to the music cassette that she had in her truck. Jazz was following the directions to a holiday cabin in the middle of nowhere that had been kitted out for guests with every luxury known to man at their disposal, to celebrate Jazz's 40th birthday party. I gather there was a chef, a masseur, cleaning staff to wait on the 6 guests that would be soon staying at the cabin. As Jazz drove down the road, the long winding path ahead of her became conspicuously caught up in a mysterious blue light. But although magnificently beautiful, Jazz said the light gave her the creeps. Everyone was saying, "Wow! Look at that delicate blue light! Where did that come from? There's no way that's natural. And more to the point, what is it?" Jazz's friends thought it was lovely, and were momentarily mesmerized by it. So enchanted were they, it was almost as if the light itself was having a hypnotic effect on them, as they were drawn to it like moths to a street lamp. It was hard to look away from it, Jazz told me. It seemed sinister to her. One of the women in the back of the car suddenly complained that she felt terribly queasy. "What's wrong with you, Rana?" her husband asked her, turning around to study his wife, who moments before had been enthusiastically bubbly and quite chipper, and was now bitterly complaining of feeling decidedly bilious. "You've gone as white as a sheet," he told her. "There's blood on your lips. How did that happen? Did you bite your lip?" "I don't know. I just feel a little odd," she said. "My stomach doesn't feel terribly good. I taste blood on my tongue, and I need to throw up. I really need to throw up." You could see she was getting close to throwing up violently. She was clutching her stomach and retching. "Please, please stop the truck. I'm going to be sick. I'm going to be sick. I'm going to be sick." Everybody was scared that the poor woman was going to throw up all over the seats of the rental car, because it was not going to be a good look, and it would be a hell of a trouble to get that smell out of the fabric of the car. So Jazz stopped the truck at once for the poor woman, who claimed she also felt as if her head was spinning, as if she was intoxicated and drunk. "I'm very sorry, Jazz, about this. I thank you very much for stopping the truck. My wife needs to be sick. There's blood all over her mouth. I'm not sure if she's bitten her lips or her tongue." "Thanks for stopping, Jazz. I'm just going to go now. Please don't come after me. I don't want anybody to see me throwing up." Scott decided to stay in the car, as his wife had insisted that she didn't want him to follow her. "What's wrong with her?" asked Jazz, turning around to look directly at Rana's husband Scott, with a bewildered expression on her face. Your wife was so well a moment ago, garrulously chatting away so happily. How can she suddenly be so sick like this? Did she eat something dodgy? I've no idea, said Scott. But tomorrow, let me tell you, she's going straight to the doctor. I mean, she's bringing out blood. Either that or she bit her tongue or lips. I'm hoping it's the latter. Maybe when she gets back into my truck we should take her to the emergency centre right away. Turn around, even if it means taking a long journey back to the nearest town, said Jazz. You don't want to delay something like this. If she's spewing out blood, I mean, because that's not a good sign. I tell you what we'll do, says Jazz. We'll wait for Rana to finish throwing up, and then I'll turn around and take her straight to the medical centre, even if it is a long journey. There's something not right about her. All of a sudden, everyone began to bitterly complain. They were feeling quite queasy. Their heads were a little blurry. Jazz began to privately wonder if everyone had caught some kind of highly contagious viral infection. And then her own husband began to have a seizure. His whole body began to quiver, shake, and jolt quite violently. So they easily took him out of the truck, laying him on the ground steadily to stabilize him, and then they gave him some water. She'd never seen her husband shake this much before, and a strange bluish spittle emerged from his mouth that rather reminded Jazz of the blue light they'd seen. Everyone was so distracted by the frantic pandemonium in the car, brought on by the rising onset of nausea that had plagued them all, along with Jazz's husband's seizure, that they'd clean forgotten all about Rana and how long she was taking to return to the truck. By all accounts, she should have at least thrown up the contents of her stomach by now, and gained some measure of relief. Jazz had seen her hurriedly running over to a tall, leggy-needled tree that looked rather beaten up and bedraggled. A little way away from the truck, she'd seen her bending over her chest as if relieving her stomach spasms, and finally the contents of her stomach, and that was the last sighting that she'd had of Rana. Before the occupants of Jazz's car could ponder as to her whereabouts, all of a sudden a strange thick mist rolled in, and you could see nothing. "What the hell?" said Scott. "Where did this mist come from? It just came out of the blue like that. There's something sinister about it, don't you think?" Everyone jumped into the car, waiting for the mist to abate, all describing it as profoundly odd, how a tsunami of white mist had been thrust upon them like this. It was ominously bodeful, and Jazz later described it as very creepy and not of this world, was how she put it in no uncertain terms. At this point in time, Rana's husband Scott was significantly worried about his wife, but everyone assured him she was probably wisely staying by the leggy tree, waiting for the mist to finally subside, because you couldn't see a thing. But everyone sensed that whatever was in the mist, it was not good. They felt all discombobulated and sensed as if they were being watched by unseen eyes, and Jazz was sure she'd seen an ambiguous shadowy figure moving around in the mist, but what it was she could not discern. But even as she began to doubt what she'd seen, as you do tend to second-guess yourselves when you're launched into a bizarre situation that challenges your understanding of the natural world, then as suddenly as the fog had miraculously appeared, like dry ice on the dance floor at a wedding, it had gone, vaporizing as fast as the steam from a kettle, so that you could see ahead of you very clearly. Rana's husband quickly got out of the truck to find his wife, but she had vanished into thin air, and no one could find her, although by the leggy tree where they had last observed her, they discovered a pile of vomit with blood in it, and found one of Rana's shoes lying next to the tree, looking as if it had aged 100 years in a matter of minutes, as the brand-new leather now looked warped. But Rana herself was mysteriously nowhere to be found. Rana's husband Scott was beside himself with grief. He was mortified. He believed something quite dreadful had happened to his wife, and that she had been lightly carried off by a wild animal, as something had been in that mist. They all knew that. Once the fog had dissipated and the strange ethereal blue light had been eclipsed, then the feelings of nausea and the stuffy head feeling everyone had experienced just faded away as if it had never even existed in the first place. It would seem all the occupants in Jazz's car felt fine,
But no one could find Rana's mysterious whereabouts, and her vanishing had not been dissimilar to my husband's disappearance, leaving everyone who witnessed the idiosyncratic event both confounded and completely thrown. If this unfathomable set of circumstances was bizarre, things were about to get a whole lot stranger. Soon after my husband George had vanished, I received a strange visitation from two men in expensive-looking, well-fitted black pinstriped suits that looked like they'd been kitted out by the finest London tailors, like Savile Row, as they were awfully smart, and the suits looked like they'd been made to measure. Over their suits they wore thick winter coats, very smart they were, and camel in colour, with brown buttons that rather reminded me of those Russian coats I've seen in pictures that people wore in the Second World War. They both had black, shiny, thick hair, cut short on the back and sides. Their skins were as white as snow, and they were both oddly wearing tight wraparound sunglasses in the middle of winter, so you could not see their eyes at all. I ask you, who does that? It was almost as if these two men did not want me to see their eyes at all. And I was suspicious of this at once, as the first question that came to my mind is, what are they hiding? They arrived at the cabin fortuitously, driving a powerful, really robust black SUV of some kind that looked like it was bulletproof and was something a government agent would likely drive. When they arrived at my door, my mountain dog Dallas went absolutely ballistic. He became increasingly agitated and began to growl, barking at the men furiously, without a hint of friendliness peppering his normal jovial upbeat demeanour, which was unusual behaviour for Dallas, as he usually ambled over to my guests and welcomed them warmly inside the cabin, but not this time. He viewed these two strangers in my doorway with an unbridled suspicion. When I opened the door, in between continuously growling at them, he lay down in front of me in a protective stance, like a doorstopper. One of the men showed me some official documentation, like an ID card of some kind, which looked rather official, and made me believe they were from the police or the FBI. Now, I'm not sure if they actually were. I guess I foolishly never paid much attention to these references, as they looked official and professional. I had no reason to doubt them. If, on the other hand, I had been more savvy, and expressed any reservations or misgivings, I'm not sure things would have panned out terribly well for me. You could sense these men meant business. They were abrasively businesslike and very blunt and to the point, with not even a hint of friendliness or approachability in their nature. It was like being in the presence of two very aggressive Rottweiler dogs that, although well behaved, you could sense could be potentially dangerous and lash out at you if you didn't behave right. I was so caught up in my personal grief at the time, with my prime focus being on finding my husband. So seeing official detectives at my door, which is what I believed they were at first, made me believe for a moment that these men might have news of my husband's whereabouts. Part of me was eager to know who on earth they actually were, but some cautionary voice inside me warned me not to ask too many awkward questions or challenge these men in any way, or things could become very prickly, and I'm glad to say I paid heedful attention to that still small voice. "May we come in, ma'am?" one of the men asked me. "We want to speak to you about your husband and his disappearance." My heart thundered in my chest. I was afraid of what they were going to tell me. Did they know what had happened to George? Did they have news on his whereabouts? "You need to put your dog away, ma'am. He's upsetting us," said one of the men in a raspy voice. The men appeared emotionless, with no expressions on their faces, no compassion in their demeanour. They were rigidly stiff in their approach towards me, and to say I didn't like them at all is an absolute understatement. I've never been in the company of two people that physically made my stomach recoil in disgust, as these men so obviously did. In truth, I felt as if I had crabs running around my stomach cavity, scratching and clawing at my insides. I wanted these men to be gone from my cabin, even before they'd entered it. My cautionary inner voice was willing them to just go away, to leave me alone, even if they did have something to impart to me about my missing husband. "Of course, please come in," I said reluctantly, putting my mountain dog away, who growled at them and barked.
He continued to frantically scratch at the kitchen door when I locked him away. I'd never seen Dallas so upset before. He didn't like these men, who also gave me an uneasy feeling. My husband and I used to joke about how if we were robbed at any point, Dallas would lightly welcome the robbers into our cabin like old friends and say, "Please come in and take all you like while you're at it." So his startling negative reaction to these two men was insanely bizarre, to say the very least. I wanted the men to remove their dark glasses from their faces, but I was afraid to ask them to do this, and I'm not sure exactly why. Maybe I was scared of what I would ultimately see. "Ma'am, we'll make this brief. It's come to our attention you're making quite a fuss and commotion about your husband's recent disappearance." "But of course I'm making a fuss about his disappearance. That's what you do when someone you love vanishes off the face of the earth," I told them. "I want as many people as possible to know what happened to him. Don't you see? I need answers. Something strange happened to him. I want to get to the bottom of this mystery. There are so many disappearances that occur on the Alaskan Triangle. Someone needs to look into these paradoxical vanishings more, don't you think? Something's going on there, and whatever it is, it's not of this world." My last comments made the men stiffen. I could see their faces were wearing scowls that suggested they were not thrilled with my ominous words. "Ma'am, would you kindly stop making a fuss about your husband's disappearance? You wouldn't want something bad to happen to your daughter Ruth, or your son Adam, would you? But if you carry on this way, they might also vanish. Now you wouldn't want that to happen, would you?" And when the man said that, he gave me a creepy, insidious smile. "Are you threatening me?" I asked, looking from one man to another in abject amazement. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I'm not threatening you, ma'am. I'm stating a fact. If you keep fussing like this over your husband's disappearance, there will be consequences. You are upsetting people, ma'am. There is a tourist industry in Alaska to consider that could potentially be ruined by your ruminations that are unfounded and based on wild speculation. You have been warned. Thank you for your time, ma'am. We shall be going now." I watched the two men stiffly walking out of my cabin, in complete and total bemusement, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. Had they really just told me to stop making a song and dance about my husband's disappearance? I wanted answers. What was wrong with that? As I watched them, something profoundly bizarre happened to the two men as they left my cabin that I do not know how to explain to you, but it left me more confounded than ever. I observed the two men cautiously approaching their large black SUV, marching towards their car in a mechanical-like stance that reminded me of a pair of rusty tin soldiers that needed an oiling. Then my eyes were steadily drawn to a Titanic-sized humanoid silhouette standing between the trees, watching the men. I would have not noticed him if I hadn't recognized that there was no longer a light space between the trees. So I looked up to observe this huge burly form, covered in long flowing dark hair. As the men walked towards the SUV, the ground suddenly vibrated and heaved like a booming drum, and the creature, which I realized at once was a Bigfoot, thundered through the trees, rocketing towards the men, screaming at them at the top of his lungs and beating his chest with his fists. The scream was so ear-piercingly loud, so cloying, I thought someone had been murdered. I stared at what must have been a 9-foot Bigfoot, who was the most intimidating creature I have ever beheld. I stood there as if caught up in a strange movie that I was trying desperately to understand. Indeed, if I was sitting in the movie theatre, I would have lightly nudged the person sitting next to me and have said, "Could you please tell me what on earth is going on here? Why did the Bigfoot scream like this? And why is he so belligerently angry with these two strange men? As if he has a personal vendetta against them and needs to settle a score." It felt like I was observing an invisible, rather unorthodox war between good and evil. If I was to personally wager a guess, These two men were unequivocally the evil ones in this fight. In retaliation to the Bigfoot charging towards them and his threatening approach, they tried to draw their pistols from their holties to fire at the creature, as I saw their hands moving towards their guns in an instinctive response. But it was like they couldn't do it. Their hands seemed to freeze in mid-air, so they were unable to reach for their guns. The Bigfoot appeared to have hypnotized the both of them in some way, so the men simply were incapable of shooting at the creature. The Bigfoot lunged towards the men, and before my very eyes he plunged his huge powerful fists in one of the men's faces. The impact was so powerful that the man's tight-fitting glasses went flying off his face. The neck was severed instantly. The man fell back on the ground, motionless, his head lying at an odd angle, like a broken flower head on a stalk. The other man remained frozen to the spot, incapable of moving. He didn't even attempt to run away from the Bigfoot's advances. I don't think it was fear that kept him so still, but I think he was under some kind of trance and was disabled from reacting in self-defense. The Bigfoot soon plunged his fist into his face as well, and it was like the head was hanging off the body, like a dog toy that had lost its face. The man fell backwards, as if he'd been shot dead by a bullet. Both men remained lying there, unresponsive, looking like a couple of dishevelled rag dolls. They were killed instantaneously, almost as if the Bigfoot had just been squatting a fly. That was how efficient his killing actually was. Even a bullet would not have killed with such precision, as incredulous as this may sound. When the men were finally deceased, I felt as if a tenebrific heaviness had lifted, and even Dallas, who'd been barking tirelessly from the kitchen, scratching at the door urgently, in a desperate attempt to get out, had calmed down significantly, almost as if he recognized peace had been restored to our cabin, and the threat that those two men obviously represented had been duly dealt with. I knew those men were dead. There was no doubt about it in my mind, and I wish I could say I had empathy for them, but I did not. I am the kind of person that never has a bad word to say about anyone, with the exception of those two demanding strangers who had inadvertently threatened me to stop making my husband's disappearance in the Alaskan Triangle so public. I suspect they also knew that I was planning to go on a radio show about the event. They had wanted to shut me up. Of that I was in no doubt. You would think that I would slam the cabin door, run and hide, and even call the police. But I sensed there was a lot more to the story than met the eye. The Bigfoot had disposed of a couple of cockroaches, because as insane as this may sound, those men that fortuitously visited me, I do not believe for a moment that they were human. I have yet to see a human skin so waxy, so white like that. And the way those men covered up their eyes, it was clear they were hiding something from me. I have a sense that if I'd seen those eyes close up, I would have known without a doubt that they were not human. But from the distance, when the man's glasses went flying off his face, I did see what I could only describe as a pair of bulging, bug-like eyes. In their insidious presence, I will say this: I felt I was in the company of two tenacious predatory beings. The Bigfoot threw the dead men over both of his shoulders. He whistled into the trees, and then three other massive Bigfoot appeared. They came running towards the large SUV that was parked stoically in my driveway. They were equally as massive as the Bigfoot that had killed the two men. For a moment the Titanic-sized Bigfoot stood together like four men in a coffee shop, and began to engage in an intense conversation together. It was fascinating to observe them, as without their hair and giant-like statuesque physiques, they would have been very human. They were certainly a lot more emotionally intelligent and human than the strange men that had visited me moments before. The four Bigfoot either forgot I was watching them, or maybe they just weren't bothered that I was staring at them from the doorway, with a transfixed expression on my face, as they talked garrulously among themselves, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, as if discussing something seriously concerning to them. They spoke in a strange indigenous language, one that I've never heard before. Mataki, kila kata tukwani, ama sika, hila sopa, hila kitakata, hopasa, ilati, notokolaba, ilati lakwa, ho basana. The Bigfoot sprang into action and then carried away the SUV, almost as if it was a piece of light garden furniture. I knew at once they intended to dispose of it. The Bigfoot who'd killed the 2 dead men, that were still heaped over his shoulders like 2 skinny sacks of potatoes, looked up at me from a distance, where I was standing in the doorway, and his dark treacle-coloured eyes met mine, and I could see how warm and kind they were. "Kola tikwana, hilasa, don't worry about what you saw," he told me in my head, in a transfer of telepathic communication. "Hima tikwana, there's an invisible war going on that you cannot physically see. The evil must be expunged." And with that he promptly glided into the woods, looking as if he was floating on air, with the 2 men still thrown haphazardly over his shoulders. I think he was intent on disposing of their bodies. Of that I was most sure. I knew better than to call the police. After all, what would I exactly say? "Oh, by the way, I thought I'd better phone you to tell you that 2 men, very smartly dressed, wearing dark suits and sunglasses, who I don't believe were remotely human, visited me at my cabin in a black SUV, threatening me not to talk about the missing persons investigation concerning my husband George. And then there were 4 Bigfoot. 3 of them got rid of the dark SUV that the men were driving, and 1 of the Bigfoot killed the 2 men. They'd probably think I belonged in a funny farm, and that my husband's disappearance had turned me into a raging lunatic. I did, of course, phone the police station to ask them if any officers had been dispatched to see me in regards to my husband, and they said to me, 'Sorry, ma'am, there are no new developments in your husband's case, and no one has therefore been asked to come and see you. That will invariably happen when we have more news in the matter.' I was left more confounded than ever. What had happened to my husband George? And why had 2 strange men, that I believe were not actually human, visited me to shut me down like this? If I thought that was peculiar, things got a whole lot stranger when Ruth, my daughter, and Adam, my son, my 2 grown-up children, that is, paid me a visit on a Friday afternoon, when I was not expecting them at all. So their fortuitous arrival at the cabin was happily received. By all accounts, you don't expect to get visitors on a bleak winter's morning, with icy temperatures and snow carpeting the wilderness in thick blankets. I had heard their truck rolling up my driveway, and when I saw its orange colour that stood out obtrusively against the white snow, I shuddered with delight like an ebullient puppy dog, as I knew the truck belonged to my son Adam, and a mother never ever tires of seeing her own children, even if they're all grown up and living lives of their own. There they were, both on my doorstep, wearing mittens, gloves and coats, and both carrying some hand luggage which suggested they intended to spend the weekend with me, which made me very happy indeed. I loved it when my children rolled up unannounced. I suspect they were worried about me being on my own at the cabin without their father being around. They knew his mysterious disappearance had not been easy on me by any manner of means. "Oh, what a lovely surprise, Ruth! How fabulous to see you today!" I said, staring up at my daughter, whose melancholic mood hit me hard. You could see she had black circles around her eyes. Her face was pinched, as if she'd lost a substantial amount of weight. Dallas raced out of the cabin, throwing my daughter off her feet. She was a slight woman, so the heavy dog could easily push her over like a light feather. She steadied herself uneasily, grabbing the door frame from preventing herself from toppling over. But once she was secure on her feet again, she threw her arms around Dallas, bending over the large dog to reciprocate his enthusiasm that he directed towards her so lovingly. "Yes, it's good to see you too, Dallas," she said, smiling at the dog warmly, her eyes lighting up at the sight of her beloved friend. "It's always good to see you, boy." Dallas let out a woof, wagged his tail, and then ran over to Adam, to receive yet more adoration from him. And he wasn't disappointed, as Adam bent over and rubbed his coat affectionately, roughing up the dog. "How are you, boy? Good to see you. I hope you've been watching over my mother for us." Dallas let out a woof as if to say, "But of course, I'm looking out for your mother. You forget, she's my mum too." "I never expected to see the both of you here. This is such a wonderful surprise. I'm so grateful, really I am," I said, unable to control the tears that were springing into my eyes and rolling down my cheeks that were difficult to hold back. "Now please come in, will you? You can't possibly stand out there in the cold all day. It'll be the death of you both. The good news is that not only is the wood-burning stove on, but the fire in the hearth in the living room is crackling away merrily, so the cabin is lovely and toasty warm. Now you're speaking my language, Mum. It's freezing out here," said my son, entering the cabin, followed by my daughter Ruth close behind. We were glad to have the front door closed behind us, as it seemed as if we were blocking out the icy cold weather. Ruth wrapped me in her arms and held me a little longer than she normally would have done. Her eyes were watery, and she sniffed. "Oh, Mum, I miss Dad so much. I wish he was here." "Of course you do, dear. That's perfectly understandable," I said. "We all miss him terribly. But as I told you, he will be coming back. I feel it in my bones. Now come on in." Adam gave me a hug, but it was short and brisk. He rolled his eyes in the back of his head and gave me an obsequious look. "Mum, we talked about this on the phone, didn't we? I told you Dad is not coming back. When people go missing in the Alaskan Triangle, they don't exactly have a habit of making a reappearance, do they? You need to accept that Dad is gone." "But I don't accept that, son. I really don't. And I'm not trying to be difficult, nor am I deluding myself. It's a gut instinct, if you like." Ruth looked rather hopeful. "You really think, Mum, that Dad is coming back? You think he's alive, don't you?" "But of course I do, dear. I wouldn't say so if I didn't believe it." "Mum, this is profoundly silly," said Adam, looking suitably annoyed, as he took his coat off in the entrance hall and hung it up on the hook. Ruth did much the same, and then they politely followed me into the living room, where the fire was frolicking happily over the wood. "Oh, it's so lovely and warm in here," said Ruth, eagerly moving towards the fire, lifting her palms against the flames. "My hands always feel like blocks of ice when I'm out there in the cold. We've lived in Alaska all our lives, and yet we never get used to it, do we?" Finally, after I'd served my children hot mugs of chocolate, Adam began to talk about a memorial service for my husband George at the church in Fairbanks. Both my children lived in Fairbanks, and so having a church service there to remember their father by seemed a good idea for Adam, but I was not happy with the suggestion and was eager to express my objections without even holding back. "Hold on a moment. Not so fast, Adam," I said, raising my hand gingerly. "A memorial service is for someone who is deceased. Your father is not gone. Why aren't you listening to me, Adam? Haven't you heard a word I've been saying? Your dad is not dead. I will not have a memorial service for someone that is still in life." "Mum, I don't know what game it is that you think you are playing," said Adam cautiously. "I don't find it remotely amusing. I understand and fully appreciate your hurting. We all are. You don't want to believe Dad is dead. But, Mum, he is. He disappeared in that mist. Everybody sensed there was something sinister in that mist. I believe it was a wild animal who attacked Dad, carried him off, and invariably killed him. If someone disappears, Mum, in front of your very eyes, then it's likely they met with a deadly predator. This is Alaska, Mum, the last frontier. It's a beautiful place, but we all know how dangerous it is to live here. Dad was unfortunately a victim to the dangers that lurk in our midst, and you need to accept that, to get your head around it, however hard it may be. I have spoken to the police about the case, Mum. They say you keep phoning the station and asking them how the missing persons investigation is getting on. He told me, the detective in charge of the case, that he hasn't got the heart to tell you that Dad is not coming back, Mum. He's seen so many of these cases, and they always end the same. That man doesn't know what he's talking about, dear. I told you your father is not dead. Mum, what planet are you living on? Dad is not coming back. Will you please both stop getting at each other like this? Said Ruth, putting her hands over both of her ears. I can't listen to you both going on and on at each other. We need to have more time, Adam, to grieve before we have a memorial service of any kind for Dad. And if Mum really believes he's still alive, maybe he is. Stranger things have actually happened, you know. And Mum's always had great gut instincts about things. Oh, please, listen to yourself, Ruth. You're talking through your head. Am I the only member of this family that actually possesses some common sense and sound reasoning? You two need to get a grip on reality. Do I really need to spell it out to the both of you, like two juvenile kiddies in kindergarten? Dad is not coming back. Get it? I know it's hard to hear. I don't like to say it myself, but it's true. I'm as grief-stricken as the both of you are, that Dad is not here with us anymore. But at least I'm not deluding myself. Doing that is only going to prolong the agony for you. He paused for a brief moment, as if reflecting on his words, and then let out a resigned sigh, and said, Very well. If you want to hold off the memorial service for a while, that's fine by me. But let me know when you change your mind. I've spoken to the pastor in Fairbanks about this, and he's happy to discuss the music you would like and the songs for the service, as well as the Bible passages that he will read for the congregation. I told you, Adam, I'm not willing to have a memorial service for your father yet. You're not ready, Mum, said Adam, his voice softening. I know it's not easy. I have the name of an excellent counsellor for you to see in Anchorage, if it helps, he said, pulling out a slim white card from his leather wallet and thrusting it into my hand. Her name is Dr. Aubrey Lathan, Mum. She's got vast experience behind her in dealing with people like us who've experienced an unfathomable disappearance or loss of a missing person. She'll help you to come to terms with the not knowing side of the experience, of not understanding what happened to Dad. I believe it's worth seeing her, Mum. It'll do you lots of good. I took the card from my son, thrusting it rather indignantly into the fruit bowl on the coffee table, with an expression of disgusted revulsion on my face. Look, I know you mean well, Adam, and I do appreciate your concern. I really do. But I certainly don't need to be visiting a psychologist. I'm doing just fine on my own. I'm not sure you are, Mum. I think you should sell this cabin and the land. Move to Fairbanks to be closer to the both of us. Out here in the middle of nowhere for a woman on her own is no life. Son, what on earth are you talking about? This is my life. My parents raised me in this cabin, you know, when I was a little girl. You also grew up here. It's our family home, and it's in my heart. I can't just sell the cabin and the land. Besides, I love being out here on my own. It gets lonely, I'll admit that, without your father around. But this is the only life I've ever known. I'm incredibly contented here, and that is enough for me. I won't have you, son, dictating to me what I should or should not do, and what you personally think is best for me. It's my life, and I make the decisions about it. Stop badgering Mum, Adam. You're bullying her, telling her what she should and shouldn't do. Mum's right. I think Mum is old enough to make her own decisions, don't you? Besides, she's running a productive business from home, without Dad even being here. So it's not like she's doing nothing, is it? Fair enough. You make a good point, said Adam ruefully. But please consider, Mum, seeing this woman Aubrey Lathan. She's very good, you know. I'll think about it, Adam. Now we can change the subject, can we, and talk about something else. Before we do, said Ruth rather nervously, I've something rather bizarre to tell you. Yes, what is it? I asked. I was in the office at work, and I got a call from reception that 2 men wanted to see me. They were in the lobby, so I told her to send them up to my office. When they came into the office, they were wearing very smart, dark suits and wraparound sunglasses. Their skins were very, very white. When my daughter conveyed the startling news that she'd been visited by the 2 mysterious men in black that were now deceased, I realized in horror that they'd paid her a visit too. And there could actually be others like them, clandestinely watching my entire family. And that was an unsettling feeling for me to take on board. What exactly did they want? I asked her nervously, unable to suppress the fluttering in my heart. They just told me they were here concerning Dad's disappearance, to let me know they knew my office and home address, and they'd keep me posted if they had any news or updates concerning him, which I thought was profoundly bizarre. They said they'd be in touch with me, and then they left. Of course, I asked them to explain what they meant by all that, and they said that you, Mum, would understand when I forwarded the message to you and told you personally that they'd visited me. What do you suppose they meant by that? I did not want to alarm my children by telling them the full details of my incredulous story, but I did, however, admit that the 2 mysterious men in black had also visited me, and threatened me not to talk about my husband's disappearance, or there would ultimately be consequences. I did not tell them, however, that those consequences the men in black were referring to were my children. I knew at once that the rather unsubtle message that you could read between the lines was, "If you don't shut up, ma'am, about your husband's disappearance, we know where your kids live and where they work, and we'll make them disappear if needs be." As a result, I had cancelled the radio interview and told the newspaper reporter that the strange account of my husband's disappearance was highly exaggerated, and I was grateful that the Scandinavian tourists had returned back to their countries and could not be easily contacted. "That is incredibly weird," said Adam. "These men in black threatened you, Mum? That's insane. What the hell is going on? I don't understand any of this." "Well, in a manner of speaking, they did," I said. "They just don't want me to go around talking about the strange set of circumstances that occurred over your father's disappearance. Maybe they're concerned it'll affect the tourist industry here in Alaska." "What are they hiding?" asked Adam, looking confounded. "Maybe they know exactly what happened to Dad. Them visiting you out of the blue like this and threatening you is highly suspicious as far as I'm concerned. Moreover, I hate to tell you this, Mum, but I had a similar visit from 2 men dressed in very smart black suits, arriving fortuitously at my workplace, their eyes conspicuously shaded by wraparound dark glasses. They were behaving furtively and demanded to see me. My secretary thought they were strange. She said they were abrupt in manner, unfriendly and almost aggressive in their approach towards her, actually barking at her in their insistence to see me. She told them they needed to wait because I was seeing a client. They leaned forward, at least one of them did, to her on the desk and said, "Young lady, we will see Adam now. Get rid of the client at once. Do you understand?" She nodded briskly, trembling in her boots. She contacted me on my intercom, telling me I needed to get rid of the client at once and see these 2 men. She was so earnest. Her tone of voice was very, very worried, so I knew something was off, and I cancelled the meeting at once and saw the men. They pretty much word for word gave me exactly the same message they gave Ruth here, about conveying to you, Mum, that they had paid me a visit, knew my home address and my work address as well. "What do you suppose this all means?" my daughter asked me, sounding confounded. "It's more than a little peculiar, don't you think?" All this conveniently happens after Dad so happens to vanish into thin air. I do wonder if other people in Alaska who've had members of their own family going missing have been visited by these strange men in black. Something weird is going on. I was glad my daughter did not know the half of it, but I knew she was right. Something was going on that was beyond my human comprehension and my grasp. I guess they're just telling us, you know. They know how to contact us all. If there's any more news about your father's whereabouts, I said. There's something odd about those men. I hate to say this, Mum, but Ruth is absolutely right. There's something profoundly odd about those men in black, my son said sharply. I mean, they wore wrap-around dark glasses on their faces on an icy cold winter's day. I ask you, who does that? Their skins were whiter than white. I've seen some of the palest people on the planet, Mum, and they've never had skins this white. They were incredibly strange, my daughter agreed. She wrinkled up her nose. Their skin was like a mask. It was almost translucent. I mean, even the girl in reception asked me who they were. They gave her the creeps. She said the moment she saw them, chills went down her spine. That's an incredibly dramatic reaction to have, don't you think? To two visitors wearing black suits who come to your offices. Methinks benign they're not. Adam was very solemn for a moment. He soberly reflected over our accounts, and then suddenly he hit the bullseye when he said, I think I know why they visited both Ruth and me at our offices. They're inadvertently telling you, Mother, that if you leak any more information to the media about what happened to Dad and the bizarre circumstances regarding his disappearance, that something bad could ultimately happen to us. Well, neither of you need worry about that. I will not be talking to the media about what happened to your father, nor to the radio, or any other random person. It's a prerequisite that I protect our family, that's for sure. Ruth's account. I was incredibly close to both of my parents, and I'd grown up in a prepossessing, magnificently beautiful cabin in the woods, 2 hours away from Anchorage. I'd come to stay with my mother, along with my brother Adam over the weekend, as me and my brother both felt my mother needed our moral support during this grievous, difficult time for the family, especially given that she was now alone in the cabin, with all but our beloved mountain dog Dallas for company. We were both very concerned about her well-being, and were not doing too great ourselves, as losing a dad in such unfathomable circumstances had rattled our cages significantly. I was naturally pleasantly surprised my mother was in good shape when I saw her. She intrinsically believed my father was still very much alive, after having disappeared into thin air in front of some Scandinavian tourists, once a strange foggy mist, at about over 10 foot high, spread out like a long sprawling blanket before them, and descended upon the tourists, blocking out their visibility, and leaving behind it the strong smell of ozone in its aftermath. My father had walked into the mysterious mist, driven by an irrepressible inquisitiveness, despite the tourists urging him not to do such a crazy, nonsensical thing, for several of them said something nefarious was lurking within the mist, that they could not comprehend what it was. Others had seen tenebrific, giant-sized silhouettes moving within the mist, but it was all so ambiguously obscure and vague, no one could be sure what they were seeing. All were, however, unanimous that whatever appeared to be in the mist was not good, nor was it remotely benign. And whatever it was, it appeared to be watching them, for they felt as if they were in a goldfish bowl being scrutinized by unseen eyes. They all emphatically believed sticking together seemed like a sagacious solution, until the mist finally passed, which it did so quickly. Regretfully, my father's insatiable curiosity and his desire to know what lay within the mist drew him into its malevolent depths, like a fly into a spider's web, or a lamb to the slaughter. There was no escape for my father, who was gone, and was never seen again after that, for he quite simply disappeared into thin air, and the tourists were absolutely flabbergasted. Contrary to what you might actually believe, My mother is certainly not one of these far away with the fairies types of people. She's not ditzy, nor is she remotely whimsically naive. She could not be like that living in the wilds of Alaska, or she'd have been eaten up for breakfast a long time ago. You need to have your wits about you, living in a merciless place like this, especially during the winter months, when the weather can be formidable to say the very least. My mother is as tough as old boots, even though her slender athletic frame would likely make you believe otherwise. She's always been as sharp as a hawk, naturally intuitive and discerning. By all accounts, her tenacious insistence that my dad was still very much alive certainly gave me pause for thought. It did not, however, go down particularly well with my brother Adam, who thought my mother was in denial and point-blank refusing to admit that my dad was gone from our lives for good and was never coming back. He was more than likely dead, probably having fallen victim to the predatory instincts of a ferocious wild animal. I think my mother genuinely felt that my dad was not dead, which was why she didn't want to argue with my brother about the matter, nor did she fancy prematurely engaging in a memorial service for my father. Furthermore, the last thing she ever wanted to do in a million years was to speak to a psychologist about her feelings concerning my father's disappearance. My mother was practically prudent, with the word sensible occupying her middle name resolutely. She abhorred the idea of sharing her personal emotions with other people, giving them a bird's-eye view of her dirty linen, so to speak, and talking about her feelings to a trauma counsellor that my brother was prescribing was not for her, with her staunchly old-fashioned values. Personally, I was surprised that my brother did not realize this. My mother was behaving a little as if my dad had gone off on a business trip, and she'd be expecting him back any time soon. I do know that the police investigating my father's idiosyncratic disappearance believed he was dead. When I spoke to the lead detective dealing with the case, he did not articulate his thoughts on the matter too explicitly to me, but I could see by his stoic, very solemn demeanour that in truth he did not hold out much hope for my father. He had been exposed to too many Alaskan disappearances over the years, where the subjects involved had never ever been found. Let's just say between 500 to 2,000 people go missing in Alaska every single year, never to be seen or heard from again. So my dad's case was another unsolved mystery among many. The truth was that my mother was not one of these people that refused to accept my dad was gone, and was living in her delusional paradigm to fit a convenient narrative that she so desperately wanted to believe. I assure you it was not like that for her at all. On the contrary, my mother had a very healthy approach towards death. She had seen her own father in a very bad state of health, and told us one morning that he would die later that afternoon. "I feel it in my bones," she told us matter-of-factly. Ostensibly, her father, whom had gone through a long insufferable illness, which had caused him to waste away, was as thin as a pencil, and so fragile he looked as if you touched him he might just break. My mother's deducements were astoundingly correct, as later that afternoon my Pops was dead, and my mother, although very close to him, had been amazingly accepting of his fate, telling us all that death comes to us all at some point in our lives. Living out here in the wilds of Alaska, we do see death as a natural part of life here. I suspect people who live out in the sticks, most especially like my family have done so over the generations, are likely more accepting of death than most. My mother's persistent proclamations that my father was very much alive was certainly not brought on by a personal fear, or a lack of acceptance, or a refusal to believe the inevitable, but simply because she genuinely believed he was very much alive, and claimed she was seeing him in her dreams, and had heard a powerful male voice assuring her that my dad would be coming back. When my brother Adam and I arrived at the cabin, my mother related to us her strange encounter she'd had with these two men in black, who had visited her wearing wraparound sunglasses and dark, snugly fitting suits, and had cautioned her, in a bullying, intimidating-like stance, against publicizing the unorthodox disappearance of my father, and the unconventional set of circumstances that had unfolded around his vanishing. My mother naturally wanted answers to so many questions, She didn't want my father's disappearance to be tucked away quietly, like a wildflower pressed between the pages of a book, only to be long forgotten about. She wanted answers to the enigmatic mystery involving the strange blue lights, the smell of ozone, and the inexplicable mist that came upon them. I know my mother had agreed to do a radio interview about it, which was promptly shut down by an unknown source, but she had refused to do it anyway, and had shut down about discussing my father's disappearance, since the foreboding intrusion from the men in black. Even when strangers asked her about it, she'd say things like, "Well, you know, things happen in Alaska, don't they? A wild animal probably took my husband." And the people would nod at her sympathetically and express their condolences, as you do. These strange men in black, whoever they were, clearly did not want my mother to talk about the incident. So what were these men hiding? I did know that the men who visited me and my brother were very much likely dead at the hands of a Bigfoot. As my mother, for her own personal reasons, chose not to disclose these specific details to us, which was probably because it made the story sound all the more far-fetched and unbelievable. I also suspect she was struggling to make sense of everything that occurred that day, along with the inexplicable messages that kept being relayed to her in her dreams, when a kind, reassuring voice told her, "We will allay the evil and bring back your husband back to you." I hasten to say that those two men wearing smart suits and wraparound sunglasses visited me at my own office in Fairbanks the morning before they visited my mother. In my opinion, they were like cardboard cutouts of each other, like two identical pairs of jeans, reproduced in the same factory, but slightly different designs, if you know what I mean. They both had dark, shiny hair and whiter-than-white skins, and the strange way they walked was similar, with a slight jarring jolt to their movements, as if their hips were displaced or distended in some way. My mother rather described them as walking like two rusty tin soldiers, badly in need of an oiling, which was an excellent way to put it. Or I might go so far as to say that they were novices at walking at all, which is another reason I suspect that they were not fully human. When I beckoned for them to take a seat, they did so with a tight, very rigid posture, and both men were insouciantly detached in their attitude towards me, regarding me with little interest or concern, like the leftovers on a plate after you've finished a satisfying meal. Their presence was somewhat disquieting and almost admonitory when they delivered their message to me. "We are here concerning the disappearance of your father, George," they told me. I remember my heart was doing gymnastic twists and turns, as any news concerning my father made me naturally nervous. I wanted to know exactly what had happened to him, but at the same time I was terribly afraid of what they were going to convey. I thought they had likely found his remains and had bad news to tell me. Had they concluded he had been maimed and killed by a wild animal, as I suspected? They showed me their badges or ID documentation. I'm not sure if they were FBI or police or government agents of some sort, but they seemed official and professional, and I regret to say I never studied their identification. "Have you found my father?" I asked them, my heart almost grinding to a stop, as I held my breath, terrified of what they'd ultimately tell me, and certain that the news would not be good. They told me my father had not been found, but they had my address and would keep me posted. "You came all the way to tell me this," I thought. It was obvious that I'd be kept informed, surely, if there was any more news in regards to the case. So why pop around to the office, causing all this mayhem and upheaval to tell me this? It was more than a little confounding, to say the very least. "Is that all you came here to tell me?" I asked them pointedly. The men shifted awkwardly in their seats, and one of them looked at me grimly and said, "Be sure to tell your mother. We paid you a visit at your workplace, or we could have gone to your home address," which they suddenly rattled off to me, as if telling me something I didn't already know. Then they thanked me for my time. I felt a little annoyed, as I could not recognize the purpose of their visit. It's like if you told the police your purse was missing, and they suddenly turn up to tell you they'll let you know if they find out what happened to your purse. You'd think to yourself, why did you bother to come all the way just to tell me that? I now know these two men were inadvertently threatening my mother through me and my brother, that they knew where we worked and where we lived, So if we stepped out of line by publicizing the details of my father's disappearance, something bad could potentially happen to the both of us. These men were duplicitous without a doubt, and there was nothing remotely redeeming about them. I have no idea who these men were or what their agenda was. My mother suggested they weren't remotely human, and I suspect she's right. After all, there was something about them that just did not make any sense. The young lady who works in reception, called Ness, short for Vanessa, came up to my office shaking in her boots. I'd never seen her look so apprehensive and unsettled before. "Who were those men visiting you, Ruth?" she asked me gingerly. "I have no idea," I told her. "They were on official police business regarding my father, but they have no news as to his whereabouts yet." "I'm sorry to hear that," she said to me. "It's hard for you not knowing what happened to your dad, I know. But I'm sorry. There's something about those men that made my skin crawl. Why were they wearing dark wraparound glasses indoors like this? Don't you think that was strange? I told one of the men that he was welcome to remove his dark glasses that he was wearing. He practically growled at me, you know, and said, 'I'll do no such thing. Who do you think you are telling me what to do, young lady?'" "He said that to you?" I asked, astounded. "I'm sorry, Ness," I apologized profusely, seeing how genuinely upset she was. "They weren't friendly, were they?" "It's not that," said Ness. "Something's not right about those men. I can't figure out what it is." She shook her head and said, "Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm probably overreacting. Look at me. I'm ridiculous, aren't I? I'm just being silly," she said, returning back to the reception, leaving me wondering why those men had been so wacko. Suffice to say, later that day my brother contacted me at the office and told me we needed to spend the weekend with my mother. It wasn't good for her to be alone at the cabin when she needed our support. I loved our family cabin, where I'd grown up in Alaska and never ever tired of going home. I was raised to be so close to nature, surrounded by the awesome wonders of the natural world, and it was an enviable lifestyle, where we went hunting, cycling, exploring, fishing, whitewater rafting, canoeing, camping, and you name it, we did it all. At the end of the day, the place where you grew up in as a child should always be nostalgic to you, if you have happy memories, of course, and I certainly did. Although I journeyed down a rocky, tumultuous path when I was 16 years old, when my world fell apart. I had tried to disappear on purpose as a 16-year-old girl, and not even my mother, brother, or even father knew about the secret that I had nursed for many years. I thought it would be easier for my parents to endure a missing persons case than face the bitter truth that their daughter had purposely tried to take her own life. But thankfully I was not successful in my endeavours, as it would seem fate had a different plan for me. After my father's disappearance, I realized him being gone from our lives was as bad as experiencing a death in the family. How could I have ever thought that my own disappearance from their lives would be easy on any of them than finding a dead body? The repercussions of what my dad's disappearance had done to us had been like having a wrecking ball hurled at our lives that was tearing us apart from the inside out. I pondered whether our lives would ever be the same again, as we had become fractured like a chipped cup in your kitchen cupboard that's never quite as robust as it was before. It becomes fragile, needs to be handled with care, before it becomes even more fragmented. Let's just say I'd never been as anguished as I was now that my dad was no longer around, and I was experiencing a kaleidoscope of grief in all of its colourless forms. I was facing head-on what I ultimately would have done to my own family if my plan had not backfired on me. My story that drove me to the edge of my despair began when I met a boy called Stephen Sawyer, whom I'd met in Anchorage at age 13 years old. He was 15 at the time. I would visit his house once a week for math tuition. My mother would drop me off while she did her weekly shopping in Anchorage. Stephen and I soon became inseparable. He was no longer just the boy that taught me math, but my very best friend as well. He often came to visit me at the cabin. Before long he became like a fixture and fitting in our lives, and visited me at every given opportunity. Even my father described him as like a second son, and my brother Adam really loved Stephen. They'd often go fishing and hunting together.
Before long, Stephen would spend full weekends with my family, where he occupied the spare room in the cabin. My mother was very insistent about this. She wanted to be respected under her roof at all times, especially given that we were both still very young. I think my parents thought that I'd probably met my soulmate, because we were like two peas in a pod and could almost finish each other's sentences. Stephen reminded me of my father. He was passionate about the great outdoors, so he fitted into our family seamlessly like a glove. Before long our family became close to the Sawyers and would spend times enjoying family barbecues and camping trips together, and my mother and Mrs. Sawyer assumed one day Steve and I would ultimately get married. Sadly, that plug was finally pulled out from our lives, yanked away so cruelly. So what may have been would never come into fruition or ever be realized. I remember telling my mother once that I knew that I had found the man for me. My mother had taken me in her arms and said, "I know, love. I was your age, you know, when I met your father. I knew he was the one for me. When it's meant to be, it's meant to be." I'll never forget the day when Stephen was due to join our family for lunch on Saturday and spend the long weekend with us. So no one was more surprised than I was when Stephen's older brother Elvin visited our cabin instead of Stephen. I knew Elvin's truck at once. It was a distinctive, rather smart red SUV that had the noisiest car engine I've ever heard in my entire life. The truck made a considerable racket. I had been chopping carrots in the kitchen when we heard Elvin's truck rolling up our drive, and the familiar sound of the death rattle the truck always made as the engine ground to a halt. My mother had been peeling potatoes at the kitchen sink, which she intended to roast to serve with roasted chicken and vegetables for lunch. She wiped the beads of perspiration that had gathered on her forehead, because it was a warm summer's day. "That's strange," she said. "It sounds like Elvin's truck, doesn't it? But we're both expecting, well, we're all expecting Stephen. I never invited Elvin to lunch." She promptly put down the potatoes mid-peel, rinsing her hands at the kitchen sink, wiping them off on a kitchen towel. She peered out of the window curiously. "What's wrong?" I asked, looking up at my mother in the throes of chopping the carrots. My mother looked at me directly, with a nonplussed expression on her face. "That's not Stephen's truck in our driveway. As I said, it's Elvin's truck. I'd recognize the noise it makes any time." "What?" I said, dropping my knife on the carrot board and hurriedly dashing over to the kitchen window to observe the truck in our driveway. My heart dipped when I saw Elvin's truck there, and not Stephen's. Where was Stephen? He was supposed to be joining our family for lunch. So what was Elvin doing here instead? We hadn't invited him. Or was it Stephen driving Elvin's truck because his truck had broken down or something? That had to be it, I thought. I tried to study the driver in the driver's side seat, whom I couldn't see clearly. The driver just sat in the truck, staring ahead of him blankly, almost as if his mind was 1,000 miles away, and he was reluctant to get out of his car. I knew it was Elvin in the car, because in the light I observed Elvin's familiar blonde hair. Stephen had dark hair. In that ominous moment my heart thundered violently in my chest, almost as if hundreds of pigeons were flapping around in me in abject turmoil. My mother's bewildered eyes met mine. We both knew something was terribly wrong. My mother's upper lip trembled, and she grabbed my hand in hers, giving it a tight, encouraging squeeze. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about, sweetheart. Maybe Elvin's here to tell us that Stephen's waylaid with a cold or something." "I don't think so, Mum. Elvin could have phoned us. Why is he driven all this way? Something's not right. I feel it in my bones. Oh, Mum, something's happened to Stephen. I know it has." "Don't be alarmed, dear. We'll find out, and I'm sure everything's absolutely fine." With heavy hearts, we both sashayed towards the front door together, and stood there waiting for Elvin to get out of his truck, which he did so very slowly. You could almost feel the sharp tension hanging in the air. When Elvin climbed out of his truck, he looked like he was carrying the entire Empire State Building on his back. His shoulders sagged,
His eyes were surrounded by dark shadows. In that moment, I ran towards him, crying out, "Where's Stephen? Where's Stephen? Where is he?" He shook his head sorrowfully and croaked, I'm really sorry. I'm sorry. There was an accident yesterday afternoon. Stephen, he didn't make it." My mother cried out, "Oh, please, God, no! No!" She let out a wail, howling like a wolf. "What do you mean he didn't make it?" I said, shaking Elvin hard. "What do you mean? Where is Stephen? Where is he?" "I'm sorry, Ruth. Stephen is dead." I do not remember anything else, because I passed out and fainted, and my mother and Elvin revived me and poured brandy down my throat. I was later to learn that Stephen and Elvin had gone whitewater rafting late on the Friday afternoon, but the fierce rapids had thrown Stephen out of his kayak, and he'd been swept down the river and drowned. No one was sure exactly what happened, but the contusions on his head suggested that he'd hit a rock. The medical examiner was sure he would not have suffered much. But her revelations brought me no comfort. Stephen was dead. He was never ever coming back. Things would never be the same again. I had lost my true love. It was after Stephen's tragic death my world collapsed like an old camping chair, and there was nothing my family could do to lift me out of my lugubrious melancholia. Without Stephen around, I really didn't want to go on any more. It would have been better if we'd never met, as experiencing this kind of pain was so bad. I felt as if I'd lost a part of myself. My family knew I was going through the dark night of the soul, but they had absolutely no idea how bad it actually was, and that I was clandestinely planning to take my own life, to put an end to my despair. The pain was insufferable. I couldn't go on like this. If Stephen wasn't here, I didn't want to be here either, and that's when I decided I would disappear. I knew exactly what I needed to do. Oddly enough, the idea of ending my life brought me a great measure of peace. I was sure that I would be reunited with Stephen again. I knew this life was not all there was, and that the spirit ultimately goes on. Leaving this world seemed like a jolly good idea. I tried not to think about the pain that I might inflict upon my family. That was not significant to me. I just wanted out. My mother, who realized I was not coping emotionally, had ensured I was seeing a counsellor, and that I talked with a local pastor, but nothing had helped. Early one morning I slipped out of the house with a backpack on my back. I left a note for my family to say I'd gone walking. I thought it would be easier for my family to learn that I had just disappeared, as so many people vanish in Alaska every year, and I would just be another one. And I thought it would be easier for them than learning about my death. My mother knew I enjoyed taking hikes, and would not have been concerned about that. She was the first to know that exercising was an excellent form of escapism, especially when dealing with grief. Losing Stephen had galvanized my walk into the woods. My intentions were so focused as I ambled steadily through the tall, lofty trees, and made my way towards the large lake, which was an hour away. If you were not fit, 2 hours perhaps. I remember it was a beautiful morning. It felt so good to be alive, as an exhilarating breeze nudged against my skin, and some of the trees jiggled their leafy boughs as if they were dancing. The woods were alive with a buoyant activity, filled with the chirruping tweets of the birds, and occasionally I interrupted some wildlife, whether it be a deer, a scurrying rabbit, a squirrel, darting up the tree. It was so early in the morning, but as I walked through the trees, I had the profound sense I was not alone, that something was following me. I could swear I heard the ground being thumped and twigs and leaves crackling behind me. But when I glanced briefly over my shoulders to look behind me, nothing was there. I even called out, "Hello? Hello? Hello? Is anybody there? Is anybody there?" to ensure I was not being followed. But I was only met with the sound of the birds and a pair of brown eyes from a squirrel that looked at me as if he thought I was as mad as a March hare. Finally I reached the silvery lake, which greeted me merrily like an old friend, and twinkled in the morning light. The surface shimmered like a mirror, reflecting the trees that spilled over the edges of the water. It was incredibly prepossessing,
that it almost took my breath away. I almost forgot that I wanted to die. I remember thinking it was sad I had to leave this beauty behind me, like abandoning your favourite coat that you were rather attached to. But I couldn't go on with my life without Stephen in it. I couldn't allow myself to be distracted by the seductive allure of the natural world that might make me scamper away from my plans, and I couldn't have that. I hurriedly opened my backpack to pull out my heavy coat, which I was intending to weigh down with stones in the pockets, so that I could ultimately throw myself into the water and subsequently drown. I could only hope that my plan would work. I began to walk across the large bridge that had been built expertly over the lake generations before I was even born. I was wearing my coat filled with these stones that I knew were heavy enough to drag me under the water. I felt reasonably satisfied that things would go relatively smoothly. I threw my backpack into the water, which was heavily weighted down with stones. It sank easily to the bottom. I hoped that when I jumped into the water, that I would go down as smoothly. I surreptitiously hoped my body would never ever be found, and that I would join the ranks of those that vanished mysteriously without a trace in Alaska. I figured that this was the best way of leaving my family, with a smidgen of hope that would burn brightly in their hearts. I presumed that would be the kindest thing to do for them. It had been suspected over the years that many people had committed suicide here. The water was deep, people had thrown themselves off the bridge, and over the years many bodies had been recovered at the lake, weighted down by heavy rocks or bricks. I glanced around me to see that there wasn't a soul around, which was a relief, and so I began to step over the railings, staring down at the silvery water beneath my feet, which was quite a drop from the bridge, but I was looking forward to it swallowing me whole and taking me far away from my grief. I just needed to jump, and it would soon be over. I was not even remotely afraid of death. I know a lot of people are, but death has never bothered me at all. I saw it as an end of my pain. I did not stop to consider the trail of devastation that I would ultimately leave behind me. As I began to climb over the railing, a voice boomed in my head. "Oh, no, you don't. Oh, no, 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 no. Oh, no, 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 you don't." I was so startled by this voice that I looked around me, but nothing was there. I wondered if I'd heard the voice of God reprimanding me for taking this course of action, which is forbidden in the Bible. Something had spoken to me in my head, with such a firm authority. I chose to wilfully ignore the voice, and began climbing over the railing. And once again I heard the voice. "Oh, no, 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 you don't. Oh, no, 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 you don't. Don't even think about it, or you'll have me to deal with." And an idiosyncratic two-way telepathic exchange appeared to begin between the two of us, without me so much as even opening my mouth. Everything was completely governed by thought. I was thinking to myself, was it really you speaking to me? And the voice returned in my head. "Of course it was me speaking to you. And I won't let you jump into that water. If you attempt to do something like that, I will simply save you." I began to challenge the creature in my head, with words that were only thoughts, but the Bigfoot comprehended them all. "But you don't understand. I need to do this," I insisted. "It's the only way I can be free." "You only need to do one thing, and that is to abandon this preposterous idea," he told me. "But I don't want to. Don't you see? I need to do this." "Why are you so eager to leave this world, when it is clearly not your time to go?" "Because I'm too sad to carry on living," I explained. "Everyone gets sad from time to time, but you cannot let it devour your life. You need to go home and get those silly ideas out of your head. Yes, you're hurting now, but the pain will soon pass. It will become bearable with time. We all lose things we love.
I see it in the natural world all the time. The mother bird loses her fledglings. They drop out of the nest, but she doesn't dwell on what happened. She starts again, weaving her nest as if it never happened. She returns to making another one and continues along on her way. She doesn't allow sadness to cloud her life, to rob her of her day, and neither should you. You must go home now, like the bird, and rebuild your nest. Don't cry over what you cannot change, as nothing you lose is lost eternally. Surely you must realize that. What is lost will one day be restored.
Maybe you're right, I said.
Of course I'm right. I'm seldom ever wrong. Munchali is always right, came his response. Now go home, build that nest, and don't come here with any weird thoughts in your head.
The next thing I know is I'd climbed off the bridge and began to walk towards the trees, where I'd seen the Bigfoot that had communicated with me so eloquently. But when I looked around, he was gone, and I felt a bitter sense of disappointment that he was no longer here. Where had he got to? He'd been there only moments before, and his words in my head had been so authoritative, so commanding, and yet he had spoken with such a soothing countenance and such a great warmth that I felt I needed to listen to his wise counsel, and I wanted to speak to him more. But no, he was gone. I found an incredible sense of peace had washed over me, and even though Stephen was dead, I no longer felt quite so devastated about his loss, as if somehow my grief had become anaesthetized and soothed, like a festering wound that had been treated with a powerful anti-inflammatory, and was no longer so rudely inflamed. I suddenly observed 2 fishermen had arrived on the scene. They were at the lake early in the morning, ready to go fishing. It was too late for me to commit suicide now. One of them was shouting to his friends, with a note of spirited enthusiasm in his voice.
Look here, Sid! Look at this footprint in the mud over here! Look at the size of this thing! You don't think it's a big footprint, do you?
The 2 men began excitedly studying the print on the shore of the lake, and I left them to it. I promptly returned home from the lake. The desire to commit suicide seemed to have left me, after the Bigfoot had insisted that it was not my time to go, and he had said this with such conviction. I was to discover that he had given me sagacious advice, for indeed you never get over the hurt and grief of losing a loved one, but with time their absence from your life becomes more bearable. I always pondered as to how the Bigfoot, who communicated with me so telepathically, appeared to know so much about me. I know without a shadow of a doubt that he is the reason I did not jump over the bridge that day, surrendering my life to a watery grave, and for that I am profoundly grateful. In hindsight, I suspect the Bigfoot had followed me through the woodgrove to the lake, but how he had known what I intended to do. I put this down to the Bigfoot's remarkable ability to read my mind. I was now significantly older and a whole lot wiser. My suicide intentions long behind me, a fleeting memory, so to speak, that seemed like a whole lifetime ago. Something I never cared to reflect over, as when I did it made me feel dreadfully guilty about the potential distress I would have ultimately brought upon my whole family, and if my body had never been recovered, they would have had no closure in their lives. Getting back to the present day, my mother had been so pleased to learn that me and my brother Adam were spending the entire weekend with her. It had certainly been an enjoyable afternoon, even though without my father being around, the cabin really did not feel quite the same. That night when I returned to my old childhood bedroom in the cabin, that my mother had kept exactly the same as the day when I first left home a couple of years back, I suspect she deliberately did this so that I always knew that no matter what, I would always have a home back at the cabin. It was reassuring to be in my old bedroom again, and I suddenly felt like a little kid as my head hit the pillow and I fell into a blissfully deep and peaceful sleep. In my dream I found myself walking through the woods and getting to the lake, where at one point I had attempted to take my own life, and there standing on the bridge was my father. He was waiting for me. I hurriedly ran over to the bridge, throwing my arms around him. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I asked him in my dream. "We've been looking for you everywhere. We thought you were dead. You've been gone for 2 weeks." He looked at me befuddled and said, "What are you talking about? Of course I'm not dead." And the voice that I'd heard that spoke to me telepathically when I first attempted to take my own life said, "He's at the lake. Come and get him. He's waiting for you." What the hell, I thought, sitting up with a start in my bed. What the hell? The dream had been so vivid that I knew I had to get to the lake as soon as possible. I made excuses to my brother and mother the next morning, saying I needed to take a ride on the snowmobile. "Do you want us to come with you?" my mother asked me. "It's such a beautiful day out there, everything covered with snow, so very peaceful." "No, I hope I'm not offending you," I told my mother. "I just need some me time, that's all." "Oh, goodness gracious me! Of course I'm not offended, dear. If you need me time, of course you must have it. You've always enjoyed your own space, and I shan't be denying you that." "Don't go for too long," my brother told me. "We don't need you going missing as well." "Oh, don't be like that, Adam. Honestly, you are the end. What happened to your father is dreadful, of course it is. But we can't just live in a prison because of it. We must be able to live our lives freely, not feeling that because one person has disappeared, the rest of us are going to vanish. That's a ridiculous notion. Ruth is going out on her snowmobile, and she won't be long, will you, dear?" "But of course I won't," I assured them. "Whereabouts are you going?" asked my brother. "Are you sure you don't want us to come with you on our snowmobiles?" "I'm quite sure. I want to go out on my own." "Where did you say you were going?" my brother inquired yet again. "Near the lake." "The lake with the bridge, is that where you're going? The place where we used to go fishing a lot?" I nodded. "It's frozen at this time of the year. Why on earth would you want to go there?" "Honestly, Adam, you're acting like a police interrogator. If your sister wants to go to the lake area, why can't she go there? She's not stupid. She's not going to ride her snowmobile over the ice, are you, dear?" "Of course I'm not," I assured my brother. "Well, don't be long, sis," said Adam, looking rather unhappy about my going off on my own. I certainly did not want to tell my brother all about my strange dream, and about my father standing on the bridge, overlooking the lake. I knew he would have laughed at me and said, "But it's a dream, sis. Surely you're not going to take that seriously." But how could I not? The Bigfoot I'd encountered all those years ago by the lake, who had persuaded me not to jump, was calling me again, and I needed to honour the call. It was probably just a dream, but I felt the need to go to the lake to assure myself of this fact. It almost felt as if I was being tugged to go there by an invisible fine thread. I whizzed through the trees on the back of my snowmobile. Everything was so quiet and so still. The world carpeted in glistening white, the trees bedecked with icicles of snow that twinkled in the light. Everything looked ethereal and delicate. When I reached the edge of the lake and parked my snowmobile, nothing was there. My father was not standing over the bridge. I felt a nauseating sense of disappointment. How could I have been so silly, so gullible, to believe a dream, and to take it so seriously? But it had felt so real, so vivid, almost as if a secret-coded message lay within the dream itself. All of a sudden, in my peripheral vision, I saw several flashes of what I can only describe as blue light, similar to that of a police vehicle, but this was high up on the top of the trees. The blue light began to whirl around in a circle, and there was a prism of golden dust around it. It was making a whirling sound, like a rotary beater, but at a very high volume. What the hell was that? The blue light flashing continued.
happening way above the trees. It got my undivided attention. The noise began to sound like several turkeys in a fluster, trying to scuttle away. I do not know how to explain this to you, but that was when I saw that something was on top of the trees watching me, high up there, and I saw a humanoid-like figure. I'm not sure what he was wearing. The details are too obscure in my mind. It might have been one of those one-piece suits. I'm not sure. Shiny and black, I suspect. But I was drawn to the face, that although human possessed bulging bug-like eyes that did not look remotely human at all. I hurriedly looked away, pondering what I should do, for if this being with the bug-like eyes knew that I had seen him, I was scared of the potential consequences of my fate. I had a sense that this thing would not have wanted me to know it was there. It continued to scrutinize me, its fiery eyes burning into the back of my skull, as if someone was blowing hot air on my neck. It was the weirdest, most confounding experience of my entire life, but I've kind of got used to weird living in Alaska. I continued to pretend not to see this entity. Then once again I heard the Bigfoot's voice in my head, the same voice I'd heard in my dream, and the one I'd heard on the day that I was on the bridge, when I'd attempted to take my own life all those years ago. The voice was authoritative and firm. "That's right. Pretend you have not seen him. Act like you don't know he's there. It's very important. He mustn't know you've seen him, or he will cause you harm." I'm not sure how that entity was standing up on top of the tree like that, but I knew he was not of this world. I also knew that he must under no circumstances know that I'd actually seen him. That's when I saw my father. He just appeared on the bridge, when moments before he had definitely not been there. And when he saw me, his face lit up with recognition and relief. At first I thought I was seeing a ghost. My dad had been missing for 2 whole weeks. He had disappeared into thin air in the wild tundra of the Alaskan Triangle, while sledging with huskies and with a group of Scandinavian tourists. He had disappeared into a mist and had never been seen again. It was almost like he had been teleported here onto that bridge. But what was he doing here? Could I actually be sure that this was him, and not some kind of holographic projection that was trying to emulate my father, to lure me in, like the worm at the end of a fisherman's line? It wouldn't be the first time it had happened here in Alaska. I mean, I'd heard of stories and legends concerning the Kushtaka, otherwise known as Ottoman, here in Alaska, well known for impersonating the ones we love in order to deceive us. I had to be sure that this was not some kind of trick. I ran up to my father gingerly, with a vacillating hesitancy, desperate to throw my arms around him, but I had to be cautiously restrained. I asked him a question that only my father would know the answer to. "Dad, what was the name of the little bird we took in, that fell from the tree when I was 10 years old? We rescued it, and he was able to fly again. Do you remember?" My father looked perplexed. "Ruth, sweetheart, you ask the strangest questions. Let's see, what was his name? Big Bird, wasn't it?" "Why did I choose to call him Big Bird, Dad? Do you remember?" "Of course I remember," he laughed. "Why would I forget a thing like that? Was it not because he was tiny, and you wanted him not to feel little, so you decided to give him a big name, to boost his self-esteem and confidence? You thought it would help him to fly." I grinned broadly. I threw my arms around my father, giving him a huge hug, tears pouring down my cheeks. "Dad, where the hell have you been all this time?" I asked him. "I'd like to ask you the very same thing. I've been looking for you everywhere, but you wouldn't answer me." "No, Dad, I'm being serious. Where have you been? You were sledging in the Alaskan Triangle. Remember, your best friend Marcus was sick with pneumonia. You were looking after his dogs for him. You took out some Scandinavian tourists along the tundra. In the Alaskan Triangle, don't you remember? On Marcus's sledge. And then you just disappeared into a mist with a blue light. You walked into it and were gone for 2 whole weeks." My father looked at me with concern in his eyes. "Sweetheart, you're not making any sense as far as I'm concerned. I don't know what you're talking about. I know Marcus is fine. He hasn't had pneumonia as far as I know. And I never took out Scandinavian tourists on a sledging trip in the tundra. I think I would remember something like that, don't you? What on earth are you talking about, love? Are you sure you're all right? You didn't fall over and bump your head, did you?"
"Of course not, Dad. But what about today? What happened today? How did you get here?"
"Well, I would think you would know that. You came with me, did you not, Ruth? We came to the lake on our snowmobiles. Don't you remember?" said my father. "Your brother said he didn't want us to be too long. You wanted to see what the bridge looked like covered with snow, don't you remember?"
I gave my dad a watery smile. What could I say? He had no idea he'd been missing for 2 weeks. And a memory lapse of 2 weeks is a long time. He had no idea he'd been missing for so long. And he appeared to have some kind of a false memory, coming out with me this morning on a snowmobile, when that had never happened. I glanced very carefully towards the tree, where I'd seen the man with the bug eyes. He was still watching us intently on top of the tree, and I pretended not to see him. But I'm in no doubt that in some way he was responsible for the abduction of my father, and had wiped my father's memory clean away. But why had he decided to bring my father back, with a false memory and amnesia that had stolen over 2 weeks of his life? As my father and I walked towards the snowmobile, I nearly fainted when my dad's snowmobile was parked next to mine, as if we'd both come out today, and that had not happened. I have no concept of being able to explain the strange set of circumstances, since I had come to the lake all on my own. I decided to say nothing to my father. I didn't want to confuse him. He genuinely believed we had ridden our snowmobiles to the lake together. And the strangest thing of all was that there was 2 sets of snowmobile tracks in the snow. He had no memory of his disappearance whatsoever. All of a sudden I heard the strange whirling sound again, and looked up towards the tree very cautiously. I saw a flash of blue, and then a flash of white light, and the man with the bug eyes vanished, but there was a strange smell of ozone in the air that was far from pleasant. As we reached our snowmobiles, I turned around to see the Bigfoot standing in the trees. I recognized him at once.
"We got him back for you," he said into my head. "He has no memory of what happened to him. The evil took him."
And with that the Bigfoot glided away and was gone from my sight, and I was in no doubt that he had helped in some bizarre way to bring my father back, although how he had helped I could not imagine. And maybe it's best I don't know all the details, because I'm sure what happened to my dad was far from good. There are no words to describe the look on my mother's and my brother's face when me and my dad just sauntered into the cabin, as if we'd never been away. My mother threw her arms around my dad, tears spilling down her cheeks.
"I knew you weren't dead! I knew you were coming back! Thank God you're all right, George!" "Of course I'm all right, sweetheart," said my father. "What are you on about? I told you Ruth and I were snowmobiling together. We went to the lake. It's frozen at this time of the year, of course. We wanted to see the snow on the bridge. You're acting as if I've been to the moon and back."
My mother continued to hug my dad, refusing to let him go. He looked completely confounded.
"To us, sweetheart, you may as well have been to the moon and back," my mother said. "No, seriously, Dad," said Adam. "This is not a joke. Where on earth have you been? You've been missing for 2 whole weeks. You were out on the tundra with the huskies and some Scandinavian tourists. There was a strange blue light and some mist. You walked into the mist and were never seen again. But now you're here as if nothing happened at all. Dad, we thought you were dead. Do you realize how serious this is?" "Son, I don't mean to be rude, but you're rambling all the same stuff and nonsense your sister was going on about moments ago. Of course I've not been missing. Don't you remember we had breakfast this morning together as a family? Ruth and I decided to snowmobile together up to the frozen lake. The one with the bridge. Why have you forgotten what we did today? There must be something in the water if you ask me. Dad, you're the one that's not making sense. You really have been missing for 2 weeks. We've been worried sick about you. You claiming to have breakfast with us this morning never happened. Nor did you go off with Ruth on a snowmobile this morning. Even though you came back on your snowmobile, I have no idea how that happened, said my brother, looking completely confounded. It's true, darling. I know it's very confusing for you, my mother told our father. You've been missing for 2 weeks. You were out on the tundra with Marcus's dogs. Do you not remember any of it? My father was visibly upset that he had no memory, as if a chunk of well over 2 weeks of his life was now missing. I think in the beginning he thought we were messing with him, until the detective on the case informed him that he had indeed been missing for 2 weeks. And even his best friend Marcus affirmed to him that he had indeed taken his huskies onto the tundra, because recently Marcus had had a bout of pneumonia and was still recuperating from it. When my father realized that he had been missing for over 2 weeks, he went to visit a doctor to have blood tests done and a medical evaluation, but everything came back normal, although he did have strange horseshoe-shaped bruises all over his body that the doctors could not explain at all. It was as if he'd been poked and prodded a little, but he hadn't lost weight, and he was in remarkably good health, and his brain scans came back perfectly normal. My father also went to a hypnotherapist, but it seemed he could not be regressed to those 2 weeks of his life, which appeared to have been a blank to my dad. There was an article in a paper that read, "Anchorage man loses memory, goes missing for 2 weeks, and returns home with no memory of what transpired." But we know differently. Something happened to my dad on that tundra, and yet despite everything, he came back to us. Could the man I'd seen on the tree been some kind of extraterrestrial? I cannot be sure. But whatever happened to my dad, I'm actually glad he has no memory of those 2 weeks, because it might be traumatic for him to have to remember an inauspicious event like that. 10 years later. Harry's account. My name is Harry, and I'm 10 years old. I love going to stay with my pops and my Grammy in their cabin in the woods. I live in Anchorage with my mum, Ruth, and my dad, David. They got married 12 years ago. My mother met my dad in Anchorage when she was shopping one day in the grocery store. They were both arguing over the last packet of cinnamon and raisin bagels in the grocery store. So in the end, they tossed a coin over the bagels. My dad should have been a gentleman and given my mother the bagels, because that's what gentlemen should do. But my dad is very greedy and always concerned about filling his stomach with lots and lots of food. My dad is like a skinny string bean, and no matter what he eats, he stays thin. My mother agreed to throwing a coin for the bagels, so my dad said if it was tails that my mum would have to go out to dinner with him. My mummy sadly lost the bet, so she had to go to dinner with my greedy dad, even though I'm sure she didn't want to, as my dad had been so mean over the bagels. I think my mother must have decided my dad wasn't too bad after all, as in the end she married him, and 2 years later they had me. My dad is always saying my mum could have done so much better than him. And I hate to say this, but I kind of agree with him. Not to be mean, of course, but because my dad is useless at hunting. Everyone knows that a man should be skilled at hunting, but my dad is a terrible hunter. He scares the animals away, and he's such a poor shot. Even my pop says I'm a much better hunter than him. But we must keep it a secret, or it'll hurt my dad's feelings if we tell him how bad he really is. My pop says it's rude to tell people things that hurt them, like if their hair looks funny or if they have a big pimple in the middle of their nose. My parents were both going overseas to England, to Ireland and to Scotland on holiday, and they were leaving me at my grandparents' to stay at their cabin for 3 whole weeks, where I would do my schoolwork from home with my grandmother helping me out. I was sad to miss out on school because me and my best friend Scott hang out together all the time. So I knew I'd miss him a lot because I wouldn't be able to play with him for the next 3 weeks. But my mum says absence makes the heart grow fonder. So when Scott and I see each other again, we'll be even better friends than we were before. I hope she's right about that. I love my grandparents very, very much, and I enjoy staying over at the cabin because they always spoil me. My Grammy says she spoils me because grandchildren are meant to be spoilt. My mummy told me all about the time my grandfather disappeared on the tundra in the Alaskan Triangle when sleigh riding with huskies. But my pops, he's got no memory of the event. I personally never forget anything, so I think it's very strange to forget a whole 2 weeks of your life like that. 2 weeks is a long time, but old people can be very, very forgetful. My Grammy can't even remember how old she is. She said she stopped counting once she got to 55. Maybe she's not very good at math. My Grammy says lots of people go missing every year from the Alaskan Triangle, but nobody knows what's happened to them. I'm just glad that Pops came back home again. Otherwise I wouldn't have a Pops, and that would be horrible. I tell anyone I meet to be very, very careful of mists and blue lights and anything that smells of ozone. I know some mists can swallow you whole, like Jonah in the Bible was swallowed up by a whale. Luckily he got spat out, and so did my Pops. But not everybody is that lucky, so you need to be very, very careful of them. I know after my Pop story I will never walk into a mist. I've always been interested in the subject of Bigfoot because both my grandmother and my mother had seen Bigfoots before, but they didn't want to tell me the details of their story. It's not unusual for people who've had Bigfoot encounters to be very secretive about what happened to them, and I'm not sure why. My Grammy says it's 'cause it's secrets, and secrets are not meant to be shared. But she said one day that I might have a secret of my own that I won't want to tell anybody about. It'll be so cool to have a secret of my own. Scott's grandmother, Mrs. Pangle, said she met a Bigfoot once, but she doesn't want to tell me her story, so it's a little upsetting. But what can you do? Because her story is also a secret. I've been praying to God for a long time because Mrs. Bollinger at Sunday school says that if you want something badly enough, you have to ask God for it. She says if you ask, you will receive. I feel a little annoyed because I've been asking God to see a Bigfoot since I was 7 years old, and 3 years has gone by and God has still not answered my prayers. But Mum says God's a very busy man and my prayer is not urgent. She says there's starving children in Africa that need God's attention first. My Grammy says it's because in heaven there are millions of prayer requests and the angels are struggling to get through them all. I keep wondering how long it's going to take to get to mine, so that God will give my prayer request attention. But Grammy says that patience is a virtue, which really sucks because I hate waiting for anything for too long. You have to wait a whole year for Christmas and Thanksgiving to come around again, so I'm not very good at waiting. When I stay at my Grammy's cabin, I stay in my mother's old bedroom. where she slept when she was a little girl. My Grammy turned the room into a special room just for me, and it's got lovely views over the woods. My Grammy doesn't really like me to play too far away from the cabin, 'cause she says I'm her responsibility and that Mum would be very angry if anything bad were to happen to me. Just so you know, Harry, I'm making some jams, my Grammy calls out to me. So you're only allowed to play in the yard. You're not to go into the wood grove, do you understand? I need to be able to see you from the kitchen window. I nodded. Yes, Grammy, I told her. Good boy, now off with you. I don't need you in my hair, and I don't want you coming into the kitchen with the sugar boiling like this. You might get badly burnt. I know how your little fingers always seem to find their way into the cake mixes and frostings, and we can't have that, can we, Harry? Now run along and stay in the yard. I need to make a whole lot of strawberry jams for the store cupboard. My Grammy didn't see that I was crossing my fingers. Everybody knows when you cross your fingers behind your back. Even if you promise to do something, it doesn't count, which means I could go and climb the big tree in the grove because my promise is disqualified. My grandfather was sitting in the living room reading a book. He didn't notice me when I ran outside. My Pops loves reading books, and when he's focused on his reading, he never notices anything else going on around him. Grammy says it's 'cause he's absorbed. My Grammy was watching me a little playing around in the yard from the kitchen window, but then she forgot to watch me any more, and that's when I slank into the woods and ran towards the burly oak tree. It's the best oak tree in the whole wide world. It's 300 years old. My mummy climbed it a lot when she was little. It's easy to climb because it's got big boughs, and when you get to the top of the tree, you can see a whole lot for miles around. It's a great lookout point. It's funny when Grammy tells me not to do something. It makes me want to do it all the more. I'm not exactly sure why, but I was pleased with myself when I got to the top of the oak tree that fringed the edge of the meadow. When you get to the top of the tree, you can see a whole lot for miles around. It's a good lookout point. So I got to the top of the tree and I sat on a branch and I watched everything. Because I didn't have to climb up and down like you do with lots of other trees. I could sit there on the branch. And that was when I heard the voices, so I began to panic. My heart was pounding loudly in my chest like a bird stuck in a chimney. I thought my Grammy had come after me with Pops 'cause she knew I'd been naughty and wandered into the woods. My Grammy can be scary when she gets angry 'cause her face goes all red and her eyes look like they're full of fire and her voice begins to quiver and quake like a miniature earthquake. Even Pop doesn't like it when Grammy gets cross because he tells her to calm down. I held my breath as the voices got closer and closer. I was happy to hear that it wasn't Grammy or Pops. But then I remembered no one should be on our property. So where were the voices coming from? They got closer and closer and the voices were foreign. I couldn't understand the funny language they were speaking. Tokalika, notoloba di kakwana, lono salina, haki twakasa, ha polaki kwa. That was when I looked through the trees, and that's when I saw 2 Bigfoots, a female and a male. They were very big. I nearly fell down from the tree. I was so shocked. The male Bigfoot was patting the female on the back, as if he was saying, "Well done." They spoke so fast and appeared to be excited about something. But then they both stopped short in their tracks and said nothing. They looked at each other, and then they looked straight up at the oak tree where I was hiding. How did they know that I was there? I was kind of scared because they were very, very big. I had heard Bigfoots were big before, but I wasn't prepared to see something this big. I clung to the branch. My breathing was fast. And then the two Bigfoots stared at me. The male nodded at me very politely, and the female spoke to me in my head without any words, and she said, "Nice to meet you, young man." And then they continued to talk together, and they just glided away and were gone. So I suppose I can't complain, 'cause God finally got to my prayer request after all. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. I really enjoyed it all. I loved all the encounters of Bigfoot, and I loved all the mystery, surrounding the Alaskan Triangle. The mist, the man on top of the tree, the strange blue light. What an incredible story. The men in black. Very mysterious, and I love stories like that. I hope you felt the same way as I did.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.